Chapter 61. The Deranged Rocky and the Hidden Threat. After surviving several attempts on his life, Saul had already figured out how Seed operated. He even suspected that the incident in Kaz's lab had something to do with Seed. If he hadn't been teleported back to his dorm by Big Pink, he might have run straight into Seed arriving to clean up the scene. He sent Jenna here, probably intending for her to die in front of me. That way, he could pave the way for Rocky or someone else after him, giving them a clear and justifiable motive to come after me. He probably already knows I've learned a zero-tier spell. To make sure nothing goes wrong this time, he'll have to come and confirm things himself. Saul looked up at Kongsha, keeping his tone as calm as possible. I can already cast spells now. I'm getting stronger. If he doesn't make a move soon, he'll never get another chance. Kongsha's mind churned slightly. Several eyes flickered in and out of visibility around her. But all of this hinges on one thing. Jenna really was sent by Seed. I'm about 50% sure, Saul said, but I think that's enough. Even if I'm wrong, it'll only cost you a few afternoons. 5 days from now is our first apprentice test. He'll have to act before that. After the test, Saul would be recognized as a standout among the new apprentices, already having mastered multiple spells. That would make Seed's move even riskier. A few afternoons. You think I've got that kind of free time? Kongsha snorted. Saul showed an awkward expression. Sorry, Senior. I'll try to think of another way. The afternoon after tomorrow, then. Saul blinked in surprise. Why was she so sure? You've let Seed know that I'm your backer, haven't you? The afternoon after tomorrow, that's when I'll be taking my test. Saul immediately frowned. You're saying Seed will pick a time when you're not around. Of course. He's been planning this for a long time. He'll choose the best possible moment. Saul's frown deepened. He gritted his teeth. Can you ask your mentor to postpone your test? No way. But moving it up, on the other hand, is perfectly fine. Kongsha smiled. She seemed to enjoy seeing Saul flustered. You don't need that second potion I offered anymore anyway, right? So taking my test a bit early isn't a big deal. Her eyes flickered in and out of sight, sometimes staring at Saul's face, sometimes at his left hand. Lucky you, very lucky. Saul let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing. He lowered his head and wiped away non-existent sweat from his brow. 2 days later, East Tower, 2nd floor, morgue number 3. Saul wasn't running any experiments. He was sitting on the lab table, absent-mindedly flipping through Speculation on Soul Vessels, a book he had just received. It had been handed to him personally by Big Pink, who told him to study it thoroughly. But staring at the silk pages, Saul's legs were jittery, and his brain couldn't even process the words. He'd often turn the page only to realize he hadn't understood a thing from the last one, and would have to flip back again. Knock, knock, knock. It's time. Saul perked up immediately. He hadn't attended class these past 2 days. He kept his schedule erratic so people's eyes would naturally fall on the morgue. The waiting had been nerve-wracking, but now that it was finally beginning, Saul found himself suddenly calm. His legs stopped shaking, his mind cleared. He stashed the book away and got up to open the door. Standing outside was a haggard Rocky. He clearly hadn't washed or slept for days. Dark circles under his eyes, bloodshot and wild. What are you doing here? Saul's tone was laced with annoyance and surprise. But his left hand was already raised to his chest. You killed Jenna, didn't you? Rocky stared at Saul, eyes full of fury. No, Saul's expression darkened. Who's been feeding you that nonsense? You know it's forbidden to kill fellow apprentices, right? Rocky's eyes reddened further. Then why did I see her red dress here? What did you do to her? Saul froze. He remembered Jenna had worn a bright red dress that day. But that dress had gone into the big chest with Jenna. What had Rocky seen? Saul forced himself to look annoyed. I told you I didn't kill Jenna, and there's no dress here. Someone's clearly messing with you. But Rocky wasn't listening. He mumbled to himself. It was you, it had to be you. Jenna's been blaming me these days for not finding her sooner. Jenna blaming him. Was Rocky possessed? Had he lost his mind? Saul took a step back. That movement triggered Rocky instantly. Don't run, give Jenna back to me. Rocky suddenly pulled a dagger from behind his back and lunged for Saul's chest. The blade shimmered with green light. It was poisoned. Saul instantly raised his left hand to block the wild swing and quickly muttered an incantation, casting demoralized gaze. But Rocky didn't flinch. He took 2 steps back, then charged again with renewed force, muttering, "You killed her, you killed her." His movements were swift and precise, nothing like the timid Rocky Saul once knew. If he'd had even half this skill last time, he wouldn't have fled in panic. Who are you really? Saul circled around the table, dodging the frenzied attacks. Rocky just grinned maniacally and lunged again. Just then the diary came fluttering out. Saul could only dodge while glancing at the rapidly scrawling text. May 23rd, year 314, lunar calendar. You were attacked by an unknown consciousness possessing Rocky. His dagger carries a terrifying cursed poison. You were slashed across the chest. Your organs began to melt, black blood pouring from your mouth. After a long battle, you defeated the enemy with a strike undead, thinking you finally survived. But it wasn't over. A new enemy arrived. A fireburst stone flew in from the doorway. You saw fire and held Tilda. Someone else was outside. Saul instantly realized another attacker was waiting, and it probably was Seed either. A long battle, then I need to finish this fast. Saul dove behind the teleportation platform and cast Strike Undead at Rocky. The spell was far more powerful than demoralized gaze. Rocky reeled as black smoke rose from his face and skin, his movements slowing visibly. A dead spirit possession, just as the diary said. If it hadn't warned me, I wouldn't have thought to use that spell so quickly. After all, Rocky looked very much alive. Without that clue, it would have taken too long to guess he was possessed by a wraith. But one strike undead wasn't enough to take him down completely. If this dragged on, it could really become a prolonged fight. And Saul couldn't afford that. The hidden attacker outside could strike at any moment. Rocky leapt onto the teleportation platform, dagger raised high, trying to plunge it into Saul's heart. But Saul pulled something from his sleeve, a disposable magic wand he had traded a pile of credits for from Kangsha. Ice Dagger. Chapter 62. The Real Enemy Appears. As Saul uttered the activation incantation, the tip of his wand swiftly formed a finger-length shard of ice. The ice crystal was sharp like a spike and radiated a biting chill. With a whoosh, it shot straight toward Rocky's unguarded head. Rocky's head was pierced clean through by the frosty ice spike, leaving behind a bloody hole that froze over almost instantly. 2 screams erupted simultaneously from Rocky. One was brief and cut off abruptly. The other was sharp, echoing endlessly like a reverberation. Strike Undead. Saul quickly cast another spell. With his current 13 joules of magic power, casting a 0-tier spell was effortless. The piercing screech was dissolved into white smoke under the spell's dark light. Enemy neutralized. Without pause, Saul glanced at the dagger still clutched in Rocky's hand. He quickly took Rocky's hand and stabbed the poisoned dagger into a subtle, unnoticeable spot under Rocky's corpse. Blood stained the blade and rapidly turned black. Saul covered the wound on Rocky's body and placed Rocky's hand aside, revealing the dagger now prominently coated in black blood. Now, all that was left was to wait for the vulture to swoop in. Duke leaned against the wall. His legs were trembling. If he didn't prop himself up, he would have slid to the floor. Rocky's already gone in. They should be fighting by now, right? He turned his head to look down the second-floor hallway of the East Tower. Beyond the motionless big guy, the door closest to the ramp was half open. Clanging noises echoed from within. It sounded intense. Duke looked down at the stone in his hand. And Fireburst stone, a gift from Seed. Perfect for dealing with apprentices who lacked protective spells. Duke only had one of these. It had to be used at the perfect moment. A sharp scream suddenly rang out from the morgue. It was hard to tell who had cried out. Did the fight end already? Duke knew it was his time to move. If Rocky had killed Saul, then all was well. But if Saul had killed Rocky, then he needed to strike now. Otherwise, in a straight fight, he'd stand no chance against Saul. Duke didn't have time to think about how the situation had gotten to this point. He gripped the Fireburst stone tightly and channeled magic into the trigger mechanism. Then he strode to the door of the third morgue, raising his hand to throw the Fireburst stone inside. A strong impact would cause the Fireburst stone to explode instantly. Whoever was still alive, or even if both were alive, didn't matter. Once this thing went off, no one would be walking out. Duke reached the doorway, glanced inside, and raised his arm. But then he froze. There was no one standing inside. The stench hit Duke's nose, snapping his dazed mind back into clarity. Rocky lay on the ground, a hole in his face, the dagger coated in blood. Perfect! Duke's eyes lit up. He had given that dagger to Rocky himself, so he knew exactly what it carried. Still, to be safe, he didn't leave. His eyes scanned the room, Fireburst stone still ready to throw. Where's Saul? But within his field of vision, Saul was nowhere to be seen. Did he escape? But I was watching the hallway the whole time. The room was a mess. A table was knocked over, empty boxes scattered across the floor. A large chest lay overturned, big enough to hide an adult. Is Saul hiding there? He spotted what looked like a hand near the chest. It had to be Saul, and he had to be injured. By now, the poison should have taken effect. Duke licked his lips, a grin spreading across his face. He took another step forward. Suddenly, a hand clamped around Duke's right wrist, the one holding the Fireburst stone, gripping it tight so he couldn't throw. Before Duke could even be shocked, another hand shot up into view, lunging viciously for his throat. The boy's fragile neck was torn open in one swift motion. Blood sprayed out. Duke stared at the crimson mist before him, confusion flashing in his mind in his final moments. How did he get behind me? Letting Duke's corpse slump to the floor, Saul still held onto his wrist, making sure the Fireburst stone didn't fall. The hiding technique Saul had just used was a zero-tier spell he had studied specifically for this day, Mage Trick. This spell was highly flexible. By altering the spell model slightly, one could change how it manifested. Saul had chosen an effect that concealed his presence. When Duke entered, Saul had actually been standing right beside the doorway, pressed against the wall, but Duke never noticed him. This spell seemed powerful, but in truth, none of its effects had any real offensive capability. It could only briefly fool the senses. Hence, it was classified as a zero-tier spell. Another reason it was so low-ranked was its unpredictability. Sometimes you'd want to pull a rabbit from a hat, only to get a toad instead. But with Saul's precise coordinate analysis method, he could control the spell's effect however he wanted. Besides this special zero-tier spell, Saul had also prepared other tools. The wand that had unleashed the ice spike earlier was actually a magical device. Magical devices were typically single-use items that had strong spells sealed inside. With a simple infusion of magic, anyone could use them. No need to know the spell itself. Unfortunately, to eliminate Rocky quickly, Saul had already used the device he'd originally prepared for Seed. Duke's Fireburst Stone was also a type of magical device, though far more destructive than the Ice Dagger, with a larger area of effect. Saul carefully pried the Fireburst Stone from Duke's hand, dispelling the magic that clung to it. The unstable Fireburst Stone finally quieted down. Saul let out a soft breath. Letting it explode in the morgue would have been bad. He was about to put the Fireburst Stone away, but instinctively switched to a semi-meditative state to inspect it first. He always did this when collecting materials from corpses. Then Saul froze. Under his scrutiny, a grayish-black insect crawled out of the Fireburst Stone and quickly latched onto his left hand, opening a huge maw to bite. Well, it tried to bite, but it couldn't break through. Saul calmly set the Fireburst Stone on the table, pinched the bug between his thumb and forefinger, and crushed it. Chirp! The gray-black illusionary bug turned to fine dust and scattered into the air. What was that? The diary hadn't made an appearance, so Saul couldn't tell what the bug's function was. The diary had always been haughty, never giving any attention to minor things like this. But Saul felt this little bug was anything but ordinary. It had to be part of Seed's finishing move. Outside the silent morgue, faint footsteps echoed. Saul's eyes narrowed. The real enemy had arrived. He immediately staggered over to his cabinet, rummaging through it in a panic, clattering bottles as he went. Then he swiftly pulled out several spare vials from his clothes, popped their corks, and gulped them all down. After drinking the potions, Saul clutched his chest in pain and stumbled toward the door, swaying as if seeking help. The door was pushed open. A figure appeared in the doorway. Seeing who it was, Saul's face changed dramatically. He stumbled backward, knocking over the work table and nearly tripping over a corpse near the teleportation platform. As his back slammed into the platform, his face twisted in pain, and he spat out a mouthful of black blood. Then he stared at the figure behind the door with a look of despair and roared in anger. Seed, so it really was you. Chapter 63, Triple-Layered Curse. Seed shrugged as he stepped out from behind the door. He didn't enter the room, just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Yeah, it's me, but how could you forget again? You're supposed to call me Senior. Saul clutched his chest in pain, face contorted as he glared at Seed. You're trying to kill me. Aren't you afraid that Mentor Kaz will skin you alive? Seed chuckled lightly, his face full of disdain. Who said I was going to lay a hand on you? Clearly just a little infighting between first-rank apprentices. I just happened to pass by and kindly came to clean up the corpses. You think you can fool the mentors? You think the mentors actually care about a few apprentices, especially dead ones? He glanced at the mess of lab tables and cabinets, letting out a mocking laugh. Trying to make an antidote. Not a bad idea, but what's in you isn't poison. Medicine won't help. Saul began dragging himself along the conveyor belt, while Seed just stood at the doorway, not stepping in, nor stopping him. It seemed he planned to wait for Saul to die on his own. Saul reached the teleportation portal, grabbed the black tassels and shouted into it, "Senior, Senior." The bright flame overhead cast a pale light on Saul's face. Seed laughed again. You really think someone coming to save you? Hayden just happens to be out today. Byron from Morgue 1 turned 30 a few days ago and has already left the tower. They haven't found a replacement yet. So, on the second floor of the East Tower, it's just you and me. What the hell did you do to me? Saul asked, dragging himself toward the other side, seemingly trying to reach the lab table for useful reagents. Told you it's not poison. Seed's smile disappeared, replaced by irritation. Hurry up and die already so I can clean up your body. Seeing Saul still struggling, Seed decided to extinguish his final shred of hope. What's on you is a curse. If your backer Concha were here, maybe she could help you lift it, but she's busy today, apprentice evaluation. Even if you called her, she wouldn't have time to come." Saul froze, looking at Seed, and finally despair crept across his face. "Urgh." He coughed up another mouthful of black blood. Trembling, he collapsed. His heavy body accidentally knocked over the lever next to the teleportation table, and the conveyor belt began to hum. Saul twitched twice on the ground, then lay still. Only then did a genuine smile appear on Seed's face as he quickly stepped into the room. He wasn't afraid Saul was faking. He had plenty of ways to control a new apprentice. What he feared was being too late and letting the diary slip away again. Seed crouched down, reaching to search Saul's body. Just then, behind him, a woman with only half a face slowly emerged from behind the black leather tassels of the conveyor belt. The platform continued to hum, masking a faint, inaudible incantation. A crystalline ice dagger swiftly formed in midair, larger than the one Saul summoned with his wand, more like a real dagger, and stabbed fiercely toward Seed's back. At the last moment, Seed sensed something and suddenly leapt forward. He avoided a fatal wound, but the ice dagger still pierced his abdomen, leaving behind a bloodied hole that quickly froze over. Had he not leapt forward, the dagger would have gone straight through his heart. Seed didn't have time to look back. He instantly cast a defensive spell behind him. A translucent barrier appeared between him and Kangsha, blocking the lesser orb of frost she hurled next. Frost immediately crystallized into delicate ice flowers across the barrier. Before Seed could catch his breath and steady himself, another ice dagger silently appeared to his left. But Seed wasn't an easy target. His entire body seemed to melt like wax. The dagger passed through him, slicing off some of the waxy fluid, but the rest quickly reformed into a whole Seed. However, the wound in his abdomen did not heal. This spell clearly allowed him to dodge damage, but not regenerate old injuries. Meanwhile, another ice dagger was already forming midair. Seed's face turned as pale as a corpse. What made Kangsha the most powerful among second-rank apprentices was her ability to ignore a certain level of mental fatigue and consecutively cast first-tier spells. Seed, on the other hand, after using a defensive spell and his wax melt technique, needed time to rest and stabilize his mental energy before casting again. Otherwise, a small mistake could harm him severely. Seeing the third ice dagger rapidly forming, its formation accelerated by the frost orb, Seed had no choice but to pull out his trump card. He lowered his hand, revealing a figurine in his palm. The moment Kangsha saw it, her expression changed. She immediately dispersed the forming ice dagger, which caused her brain to throb violently from the sudden interruption. Within her glass skull, several eyeballs floated into view, all staring unblinkingly at the figurine in Seed's hand. "You dare carry an elf figurine with you? Aren't you afraid you'll suddenly go insane one day?" Seed took the opportunity to steady his mind. Even now, pulling out the elf figurine was a dangerous move. But he still flashed a roguish grin. "I have my ways. Without this, you'd never even give me a chance to speak." Kangsha had attacked the moment she appeared, followed by relentless killing blows. Seed didn't even have time to chant, let alone stop her. "Kangsha, we don't need to fight to the death over a servant," Seed said, glancing at Saul. The latter looked deathly pale, black blood leaking from the corners of his mouth, seemingly seconds from death. Seed felt his plan coming to fruition and couldn't hide his excitement, especially one who's about to die. "But he's useful to me," Kangsha replied coldly. "What did you do to him?" "A triple-layered curse, that's all," Seed said nonchalantly. "Triple-layered?" Kangsha asked, her many eyeballs still fixated on the figurine, none retreating into her brain. "That requires 3 lives, so those 3 new apprentices were sacrifices you fed to Saul." "Exactly. The kid's ruthless, never hesitates. Although he didn't technically kill the first one, they died right in front of him. The lingering death aura still clung to him. Seed proudly revealed his method. "So, Kanksha, are you really going to fight me over someone doomed to die?" Some of Kanksha's eyes flicked to Saul, then quickly turned back. Seeing her hesitate, Seed pressed further. "All I want is this brat's corpse to vent my anger. Everything else, you can take it." Kanksha said nothing, seemingly accepting the offer. Seed, still holding the figurine carefully, kept his eyes on Kanksha as he slowly stepped toward Saul. On the ground, Saul barely lifted his head, watching Seed draw nearer. He looked desperately toward Kanksha. But all of her eyeballs were still fixed on the figurine in Seed's hand, seemingly oblivious to Saul's silent plea. Seed, still watching Kanksha, stepped forward again. Suddenly, his leading foot stomped hard onto the floor, cracking the stone tiles beneath. Using the rebound force, Seed launched himself backward, abandoning Saul and heading straight for the door. In the next instant, two ice daggers came crashing down from above, stabbing through the spot Seed had just been, shattering two more tiles. Kanksha clicked her tongue in regret. That Seed was just too cautious. If he escaped today, she might never get such a clean shot under the guise of self-defense again. And with the elf figurine in his hand, she didn't dare go all out with her spells. A surge of mental energy could easily trigger hallucinations through the figurine, potentially without her even realizing. That would be too dangerous. Seed's expression twisted with rage. This escape had cost him a perfect chance to recover the diary. Luckily, the diary itself looked plain. Even if Kanksha saw the hardcover book that had fallen off Saul, she might not pay it any mind. He still had a shot at reclaiming it. Just as both Seed and Kanksha were lamenting missed opportunities, a figure suddenly appeared behind the crimson door and delivered a solid punch that sent the escaping Seed flying back. Chapter 64, Senior, I got you a gift. Seed was caught off guard, staggering backward from the punch to his face. A warm trickle of blood immediately ran from his nose. He looked up in shock, stunned to see someone who absolutely shouldn't be here. "Byron, why haven't you left the tower?" "Byron." Even Kanksha looked surprised as she stepped down from the teleportation platform, subtly giving the fallen Saul a nudge with her foot. "Yeah," faced with their questions, Byron only nodded slightly. Well, no point asking him anything. Seed instantly realized he'd been ambushed. There was no escape. This guy was ruthless to others and to himself. He suddenly raised the elf figurine in his hand and smashed it hard against the wall. Byron and Kanksha stared at the statue, their expressions changing instantly. The fragile elf figurine cracked in half from the impact. The head rolled off, spinning across the floor. The statue was only a finger's width thick, hollow inside, completely empty. Yet it felt like something was there. As the statue shattered, silence fell over the morgue. "You're completely insane." Even Kanksha lost her seductive charm, glaring at Seed with venom in her eyes. Byron finally realized what Seed had been holding. His brows furrowed deeply. The hand Seed used to hold the remaining half of the figurine instantly withered and shriveled, like that of an 80-year-old man. He hunched over, chest heaving, his eyes darting between Kanksha and Byron. "The moment you ambushed me, I knew there'd be no reconciliation today. So if that's how it is, then we all go down together." Seed raised the statue and walked toward Kanksha. Kanksha's eyes spun rapidly, and in the end she actually stepped aside, exposing the unconscious Saul behind her. Seed now looked like a walking bomb, forcing two powerful second-rank apprentices to hold back. When Byron tried to approach, Seed immediately raised his hand again, forcing him to retreat once more. Just like that, Seed maneuvered the two of them around, until he ended up beside Saul while Byron and Kanksha stood at the doorway. "You think you're getting out of here?" After a long silence, Concha finally spoke. With the elf figurine's power leaking, none of us can use our mental bodies, but you holding on to it, you'll fall into an illusion sooner or later, even if you don't move. Then we can easily kill you. Sorry, Seed grinned savagely. My family has night heritage. Without spells, you can't stop me. Don't come any closer. He barked at Byron again, stopping him in his tracks. Right now, Seed looked a mess, face covered in blood, a gaping hole in his stomach. But he was feeling triumphant. For the first time, he had forced two strong opponents to back off. He stared at the two of them, slowly crouching next to Saul. The little servant boy beside them wasn't moving, probably dead. Seed reached out to feel for a pulse. Nothing. He's really dead. Grandfather, Seed screamed inwardly, do you see this? I'm the real hope of the family. The diary of dead wizard you've searched so long for is almost in my hands. Ha ha ha. Seeing Seed's strange expression, Byron stepped forward again. Don't move. Though excited, Seed remained alert. As soon as Byron moved, he threatened him again. Come any closer, and I'll show you what a hallucination feels like. You think Concha won't strike while you're stuck in one. But before Seed finished his sentence, he suddenly felt something slam into his gut, right into his open wound. The pain was blinding. He looked down in alarm and saw that Saul, who had appeared motionless, had somehow gotten up and was shoving something into the hole in his belly. It was as thick as a fist and about the length of a palm. Senior, Saul grinned wide, his mouth and teeth stained black. With his left hand, he shoved the thing deeper. Here's a gift. Furious and in pain, Seed swung a punch at Saul. Saul tried to block with his left arm, but still got sent flying. Even as he crashed to the ground, Saul looked thrilled. He turned his head and shouted to Byron and Concha, "Get down." Seed panicked, trying to dig the thing out of his stomach, but it was jammed tight between chunks of ice. Boom! The explosion wasn't nearly as loud as expected, more of a dull thud. That startled Saul. Crap, did Kelly sell me a fake? His back slammed hard against the floor, but he strained his neck to look at Seed. Seeing the result, Saul finally exhaled in relief. The grenade, no, the iron fire blast, wasn't explosive in the traditional sense. It seemed all its power had been compressed, focusing entirely on the target. Seed was blown in half. Both his upper and lower body were pierced from within by iron shards. This iron fire is amazing, definitely a wizard tool. Not a single shard was wasted. Seed seemed to fall into a pile of iron cacti at this moment. His mouth opened, and blood mixed with iron dust dripped to the floor with a clear, metallic clink. Seed never expected that, after threatening two second-rank apprentices, he'd be taken down by a servant boy. You how weren't cursed? That was what puzzled Seed most. But Saul gave no explanation. He simply backed away in silence. Seed collapsed to the floor, eyes still fixed on Saul. Then a thick, hardcover book suddenly appeared before him. It was so close, he could reach it if he tried. Seed's eyes went wide. Concha Byron saw the tower, his grandfather. None of it mattered anymore. All he could see was that book, that red leather-bound book. Mine, he mouthed silently, reaching for it. But he grabbed only air. His hand passed right through it, again and again, until it finally dropped to the floor. Saul looked at Seed, puzzled. The guy was grabbing at empty air, not even bothering with final words. Nervously, Saul glanced at his own left shoulder. The diary still floated quietly there. All good. He stood up and spat out the foul black blood in his mouth. Pay, Senior Concha, Senior Byron, he's really dead now, right? Byron stepped forward first, bent down to check carefully and nodded. Yeah. Concha didn't move right away. She first picked up the elf figurine Seed had smashed and sealed the two halves in a small box. Only then did she sigh in relief. the terrifying eyeballs finally retracting. "If you really want to be sure he's dead, that's easy," she said as she walked over, tossing a saw from the console toward Saul. "Cut off the head. Dead or not, that'll do it." Saul was very practiced at this. Byron wasn't exactly new to it either. A screeching noise rang out, blood splattering. Saul placed Seed's severed head in a box, wrapped it in pale yellow leather, and handed it to Kangsha. She accepted it and let out a long breath. "Good. With you killing Seed, we've got an even stronger case for justified retaliation." One of her eyeballs floated up from the milky liquid and swiveled to look at Saul. Kangsha smiled suddenly. "But I'm really curious now. Why exactly was Seed so determined to kill you?" Saul had already prepared a story. "A few months back, when I was still a servant, I caught Seed stealing something in the library. He attacked me on the spot. I was badly injured but survived. Ever since, he's been worried I'd talk and tried to kill me a few times." Saul had once considered using what Seed knew about Kangsha stealing brains to tie her and himself together, but Kangsha quickly saw through it and threatened him. Now that Seed had risked the illusions just to kill Saul, of course Kangsha was suspicious again. So Saul told the truth, everything that a bystander could have witnessed, except for the diary of a dead wizard. That only Saul could see. Chapter 65. "Hello, backer. This is my new backer." Kangsha was not at all satisfied with Saul's honest explanation. "Oh, really, tilde," she stretched her tone as another eyeball floated up, locking onto Saul. "Then, why did he make a special trip to collect your corpse? And why did you seem so sure he'd show up?" Saul broke into a cold sweat under the stare of that eyeball. "I already explained this, Senior Kangsha. After the test, my strength would be revealed and it'd be hard for him to secretly make another move against me. So this was likely his last chance to act. He'd come to confirm my death." The intense pressure from the eyeball made Saul want to hide behind Senior Byron. "Oh," Kangsha's red lips curved into an even wider smile. "Why do I get the feeling it's because you took something Seed's been searching for? That's why he's been keeping an eye on you." Cold sweat trickled down Saul's back. "Too bad you two seem to have agreed not to mention a word of it." Kangsha extended a pale hand, gently brushing Saul's cheek. "So, would you be willing to tell me and Byron?" But at that moment, Byron suddenly reached out and moved Kangsha's hand away. "What do you mean by that, Byron?" Kangsha instantly summoned another eyeball to glare at him. She thought, "If you couldn't tell there was something off about those two, I wouldn't even be interrogating Saul in front of you. And now you're ruining it for me." Outwardly, though, she smiled softly. "Aren't you curious about Saul's little secret?" Byron shook his head firmly. "HMPH." Kangsha stared at him, more eyeballs rising into the air. But Byron was completely unfazed, his expression as lifeless as a corpse as he met her gaze. In terms of aura, Byron was slightly weaker, but Kangsha was the first to back down. "Well then, since you're not interested, go ahead and take Seed's corpse back. I still have to heal my little friend." Byron only nodded again. Tilde. Kangsha raised her hand, and icy crystals began to gather in her palm. "Did you forget who the strongest second rank is?" Saul suddenly peeked out from behind Byron and smiled at Kangsha. "That's you, of course, because Senior Byron is already a third-rank apprentice." The chill that had been spreading from Kangsha's body suddenly froze midair, and the ice crystal in her hand dissolved into faint stardust. "You," she took a half-step back in disbelief, glancing from Saul to Byron. "Aren't you already 30? Byron scratched the back of his head, and without needing to slit his throat, a seam opened on his neck, revealing sharp teeth underneath. "I advanced just this month." Just one look at Byron's throat, and Kangsha could tell he wasn't lying. He could now control his skin more naturally. "But your locator couldn't integrate." Byron pointed at Saul. "Because of him," Concha felt her brain spinning. Impossible. She suddenly pursed her lips, falling silent. She didn't ask further, but several of her eyeballs turned toward Saul, studying him like it was her first time meeting him. Just a few months ago, he had been terrified and begged her to save him. And now, he'd completed multiple body modifications, secured Byron's support, and even killed Seed. Seeing Concha wavering, Saul stepped out from behind Byron. "Senior, will you still need your brain next month?" Concha paused, then abruptly retracted her menacing aura. Her red lips curved into a charming smile. "Of course I'll need it. And if there's another opportunity like this," she shook the severed head in her hand, "don't forget to invite me." With that, she tidied her battle-rumpled clothing, hooked a finger to adjust her collar slightly, and flicked it back. "Little one, you really know how to pick your backers." Saul gave a polite smile but thought to himself, "If I told you who my real backer was, it'd scare you to death." Concha walked away, half her face still filled with complicated emotion. Byron turned to Saul with an equally complex look. Saul looked at Byron's spooky but strangely sincere face and grinned. "Senior, want to know why Seed targeted me?" Byron's throat opened. "Conflicts happen every day in the Wizard Tower, resources, influence. I've lost interest." He'd worked in the morgue for over a decade, dealing with countless corpses of people he once knew. "By the way, Senior, you can talk now without slitting your throat." "I'm a third rank now," Byron said, touching his throat. "I used to avoid speaking because I couldn't control my skin, but with the modification plan you gave me, I had a breakthrough. I always wanted to fuse with it to hide who I really was, but I forgot. I'm already complete as I am. It can be my weapon, my shield, but it must never be me. Once I understood that, I could finally fuse my locator and advance to the third rank. It helped that much. No wonder you insisted on owing me 100 credits, but with your help this time, I'd say we're even." Saul glanced at Seed's headless corpse, a little pained. He'd used up the single-use sorcery items from Kelly and Concha, spent a fortune on a fake death potion, and paid heavily to enlist Concha and Byron's help. Now he was back to square one, flat broke. But at least the threat of Seed was gone. Seed hadn't just attacked Saul multiple times, making his life miserable. He also knew about the diary of dead wizard. He had to be eliminated. The man might not have known the diary's full capabilities, but even his partial knowledge was a threat. Some secrets just can't be shared, especially when they're priceless. The human heart can't stand being tested. Best not to test it at all. The only question was, besides Seed, did anyone else know about the diary of dead wizard? "So?" Byron's voice pulled Saul from his thoughts as he stared blankly at Seed's corpse. "Remember, what you have is more valuable than any treasure." Saul's heart skipped a beat. "Does Senior Byron know?" Byron's tone grew solemn. "Knowledge and life, those are the most important things for a wizard." Saul's mouth opened slightly. It seems I misunderstood. Senior Byron was giving him a lesson." "I understand, Senior." Placing life alongside a wizard's pursuit of knowledge. Perhaps it was to remind him that without life, nothing else mattered. Senior Byron's outlook was as grounded as ever. Seeing Saul genuinely reflecting on his advice, Byron was pleased. "Oh, right." Byron reached into his mouth and pulled out a notebook to continue recording. "As agreed, my assistance this time clears the credit debt." Then he scratched a few lines. "But since you ultimately took down Seed yourself, I'll deduct a bit less. That leaves 16 credits remaining." "No problem," Saul responded without hesitation. 16 credits, that was over 5 months of his base salary. Byron took everything from Seed's body, leaving Saul with a stripped-down corpse, claiming the second rank's items were still too dangerous for him. If Saul hadn't seen the gleam in Byron's eyes, he might have actually believed the honest act. When dividing the spoils, Saul asked about the elf figurine, but Byron repeatedly shook his head and warned him to stay far away from anything related to elves until he became a true wizard. Afterward, Byron helped examine Saul's body and took care of the other corpses in the morgue. The infatuated youth Rocky's body showed no signs of mutation. Previously possessed by a wraith, his face was now unrecognizable. Saul didn't know what he'd been through or why the wraith targeted him, just that he was a poor, manipulated soul. Byron explained that someone had secretly placed a wraith's host item on Rocky. The wraith invaded his mental body when his emotions were unstable and his mind was weak. Eventually, they found a cracked magic crystal in Rocky's wallet. That was the host item. No one knew who had slipped it into his pocket. Now that the wraith was destroyed, the host item had been rendered useless. For second-rank apprentices, such low-level items were easy to identify. Even first-rank apprentices with strong mental stability wouldn't be affected too badly. But Rocky's poor state and weak mind made it all too easy for him to lose control. So pitiful, Saul sighed and slipped Rocky's wallet into his own pocket. Chapter 66. Hello, Senior. Goodbye, Senior. Rocky was placed into the large box meant for storing corpses. Next was Duke. Duke also carried a curse. Within the fireburst stone, he wielded lay the most dangerous component of the triple-layer curse, the shadow curse worm. And Duke's death was the final step required to awaken the curse worm. Seed probably figured that even if Duke failed to blow you up, his death could still activate the curse and kill you that way, Byron said, rubbing his Adam's apple with a puzzled look. I'm not surprised you dodged the fireburst stone. I'm only a little surprised you managed to evade the curse worm too. But how did you even simulate something like coughing up black blood on the spot? Saul retrieved a small, dark red vial from his locker. This was a byproduct from my body modification experiments. I call it concentrated plasma. Once activated, it turns into a large volume of blood. I can even add pigments to change its color as needed. Non-toxic, harmless, and perfect for faking death. In TV terms, it's basically a blood pack. As for why it was black, Saul couldn't exactly say. The diary told him. Rocky's dagger was poisoned. I figured pretending to be poisoned might make any other enemies let their guard down. In truth, Saul had taken a potion that slowed breathing and heart rate, essentially a death simulation drug. It was just a precaution. Saul took Duke's wallet and placed his body into the large box, letting him keep Rocky company. Byron informed Saul that the corpses of Rocky and Duke were both contaminated by the triple-layer curse. Just like Jenna before. Their deaths were all tied to Saul. Once they were all dead, the shadow curse worm hidden in the fireburst stone would emerge and attempt to burrow into Saul's body, devouring his flesh. This was something neither Byron nor Concha had anticipated. They'd been missing one key premise. Seed couldn't act directly against Saul, the diary's owner, unless Seed abandoned the diary of dead wizard. So Byron and Concha had both considered the worst-case scenario to be Seed taking the risk of punishment and attacking Saul personally. But in reality, Seed had chosen a far more complex and costly method to try and kill Saul. That might have been what sparked Concha's curiosity about the entanglement between Seed and Saul. If Saul hadn't been wary of Concha and made Byron, now a third-rank apprentice, his backup plan, today's events might have ended very differently. Ever since the diary had revealed that Concha was willing to sacrifice his life to use Saul, Saul had stopped viewing her as a reliable protector. Things were better now. They'd become mutual beneficiaries in a transactional relationship. Concha had probably already figured out that Saul never took the medicine she gave him. Once everything was wrapped up, Byron took out his little notebook, jotting things down and deducting fees for explaining curse knowledge and inspecting the morgue. After confirming there were no further threats in the corpse chamber, Byron bid Saul farewell and returned to organize his gains from today. The third corpse chamber was finally down to just Saul. Saul walked over to Seed's mangled remains and hauled them onto the teleportation platform. He turned and picked up several sharp tools from the cluttered workstation. With a respectful tone, he said to the mutilated corpse, "Hello, Senior." He paused, a pale smile appearing on his face. "Goodbye, Senior." What? Saul shivered. His eyes flew open to an icy sensation all over his body. That's when he realized he was completely naked. Above him, the ceiling was lit by cold, pallid candlelight. Unfamiliar symbols spun and danced in the air, and a chilling aura, along with the faint sound of sobbing, wriggled into Saul's skin like tiny insects. Tab, tab, tab. Footsteps were approaching. For some reason, a sudden fear seized Saul. He bolted upright and found himself lying on the teleportation platform in the corpse chamber. The tough feel of black leather beneath him made it clear he'd been treated just like one of the corpses. Tab, tab, tab. The footsteps grew louder. Saul swallowed hard, but his throat was parched and sore. Looking to the side, he noticed the scarlet door of the morgue hadn't been completely shut. Behind the hand-wide gap lay a deep, impenetrable darkness. And behind that darkness, fear was drawing closer. Tab, tab, tab. The footsteps were nearly at the door. Jolted awake by the dread, Saul didn't spare another thought. He leapt barefoot to the floor. He had a gut feeling. If whoever was making those footsteps found him, the consequences would be terrifying. I need to hide. He scanned the room. No corpses, no blood, no scattered tools. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a pale hand press against the red door. Saul didn't hesitate. He dove into the large box beneath the work table. The door must have opened without a sound, because now the footsteps echoed inside the room. They're looking for him. Saul was certain, even though he didn't know who it was. I should have shut the lid. Lying beneath the work table in the pitch black, Saul's thoughts raced with anxiety, but I didn't have time. The footsteps circled the room. Reaching for the lid now would only expose him. This box is right under the table, with walls on all sides. As long as they don't stick their head in here, I should be hidden. Saul lay pressed flat against the floor, barely breathing. Suddenly, the footsteps drew closer. Closer. They stopped right beside him. There was some static noise above on the table, then silence. Why isn't there any sound? Saul wanted to peek out just a little. But he didn't dare. Why are the footsteps gone? Wait, did they find me? Are they bending down? Are they trying to squeeze their head into the gap between the table and this box? Are they? What? Huff. Saul jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat. Another nightmare. He frowned, climbed out of bed, changed into fresh pajamas, and wiped his sweat-streaked forehead with his discarded clothes. This is the second night I've had the same nightmare. But in the dream, I can't tell anything's wrong. I don't know I'm dreaming. I don't even have the courage to fight back. All I feel is fear, like I'm back to when I first transmigrated into this servant's body. That sense of waiting for something unknown to appear, that cold, creeping terror, was all too vivid. Even now, fully awake, Saul could remember the helplessness he felt in the dream. Deep down, he felt this dream wasn't ordinary. If he was discovered by the figure in the dream, something terrible might truly happen. 2 nights in a row now with nearly the same dream. And today, the dream had progressed. The owner of the footsteps had nearly found him. If Saul hadn't woken up in time, he might have seen a face appear above him. In today's dream, the footsteps were already right on me. If I dream it again tomorrow, will I be found? It was just a dream, and yet Saul couldn't shake the unease. He turned to glance at the diary on his left shoulder. The diary was sound asleep. If something dangerous happens in a dream, will the diary warn me? I'll go find Senior Byron again this afternoon and have him check me out. Why afternoon? Because Saul couldn't skip class in the morning. This morning was their first-rank apprentices' first assessment. Chapter 67, A Turbulent First Test. Fearing he would fall asleep and dream again, Saul spent the latter half of the night meditating with the crystal orb in his hands. Although the transformation of his left arm into a wizard body had greatly increased his magic power, it hadn't done much to change his inherent magical talent. In other words, improving his magic power in the future would still be a major challenge. Fortunately, the most pressing danger had already passed. Saul could now afford to take safer approaches or continue modifying his body to enhance his magic. At 8 a.m., the hourglass clock signaled it was time for him to leave. He slung on his bag and headed toward Mentor Kaz's laboratory. Senior Mark was absent today, leaving only Angela huddled nervously in the corner of the lab. When she saw Saul enter, she forced a smile and greeted him. "Good morning, Saul." Morning." Saul glanced at Angela and noticed she had already lowered her head again, keeping to herself. She seemed incredibly tense. Saul let out a soft breath. Well, truth be told, he was nervous too. Even in his past life as a corporate drone, he'd taken his share of professional exams. And every time, he'd been anxious, never quite able to pull off the calm of a seasoned adult. That was the price of preparing for a test without actually preparing. But the nerves this time felt different from before. The first-rank apprentice test was held once a month, but new students were given 3 months to prepare for the first one. From the attitude of the mentors and the remarks of the senior students, it was clear that failing the exam wasn't a mere inconvenience. It wasn't as simple as just retaking it. What's the worst that could happen if I fail the test? They wouldn't actually turn me into flower fertilizer too, right? Saul had confidence in his own strength, but the real source of his anxiety was the authority of the tower and the overwhelming power of the official wizard. First-rank apprentices were just too weak in comparison. The two of them waited in the lab from 8 to 9 a.m., and the atmosphere only grew heavier with each passing minute. But Mentor Kaz never showed up. As Saul was zoning out, trying to calm himself, he suddenly noticed Angela walking toward him. She sat down on a stool about a meter away. "Saul, do you know where Duke went? He hasn't been to the lab in days," she asked cautiously. "He's dead," Saul replied flatly. Angela's head snapped up, but just before meeting Saul's gaze, she quickly looked away. Oh. Her fingers fidgeted anxiously, and she shifted in her seat as if struggling with something. Angela clearly wanted to change the topic. "The test is at 9 today, right? Why aren't the mentor or senior here?" Saul didn't know either, and was just about to suggest going out to check. When the sound of footsteps approached, Senior Mark walked through the door. He didn't greet them, and instead rushed into the lab to start gathering materials. Once he'd packed what he needed, he finally spoke, without even looking back at them. "The mentors have an unexpected situation. All new apprentices are to take the test in the 10th floor common classroom. Get moving." Angela gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Saul stood up immediately and followed Mark out of the lab. Other apprentices were also emerging from their respective labs in small groups, holding books or carrying bags. Everyone wore puzzled, uneasy expressions and whispered among themselves. Angela caught up from behind, quickening her pace to walk beside Saul. Strangely, even though she'd clearly been frightened by him moments ago, she still stuck close to him now. That made Saul feel a little suspicious. Just as Angela opened her mouth to speak again, someone suddenly forced their way between them. "Good morning, Saul." "Oh, morning, Angela." After casually greeting Angela, Kelly turned to examine Saul. "You look worse and worse these days." Saul gave a bitter smile. "Had a nightmare." "Nightmare? With your mental strength, ordinary dreams shouldn't affect you. Are you sure you're not being haunted or cursed? Want someone to check it out?" Kelly had keen instincts and quickly noticed the potential issue. Apprentices with developed mental power rarely dreamed without cause, especially not nightmares. So as soon as Saul mentioned one, Kelly immediately suspected he'd gotten himself into something. When she said someone, she emphasized the word heavily. She meant Byron. "Yeah," Saul nodded. He was thinking the same. Senior Byron, who worked in the morgue, probably had plenty of experience dealing with spirits and curses. But he had just been promoted to a third-rank apprentice and was busy with paperwork, moving and picking up new materials. His morgue duties had been handed off to a new second-rank apprentice. If Saul wanted to find him, he'd have to go to his new dorm. If it weren't for the lingering unease the dream had caused, Saul wouldn't have considered bothering Senior Byron. He didn't like being a burden, especially when he was already low on credits. Angela walked quietly beside them, her steps growing slower. The moment Kelly joined Saul, she'd struck up a lively conversation with him, and Saul, normally reserved, was laughing and talking along with her. Angela bit her lip, silently regretting her earlier hesitation. Saul had one of the strongest mental talents among all first-rank apprentices, but back then, it seemed like he'd offended a second-rank apprentice, and even his mentor didn't seem to think much of him. That's why Angela hadn't tried to get close. She just didn't want trouble. Not everyone could afford to be as bold as Kelly. Still deep in conversation, Saul and Kelly moved quickly, their long strides soon leaving Angela behind. The temporary testing room on the 10th floor was quite large, and around 20 new students were scattered throughout. 3 months of studying wizardry had already led to the formation of several small cliques. A few loners sat apart, silent and solitary. Saul and Kelly, as usual, picked seats in the back row. Angela didn't follow this time. She found a seat on her own. "Didn't she always avoid you before? Why's she suddenly sticking to you now?" Kelly asked, resting her chin on her hand. "She's probably nervous," Saul replied, not thinking much of it. "Do you know what's going on? Why the test was moved here and why we're all doing it together?" "I don't really know. I was eating breakfast with Mentor Guido when he was suddenly called away. Then I got the notice about the test change." "Eating breakfast with Mentor Guido?" Saul asked with effort. "Yeah." Kelly wore an expression like, "I don't even know how this happened." "I've totally gotten used to his vomiting. I can even eat bread right next to him now without flinching." Saul wasn't sure whether to be envious of Kelly for being able to eat with Mentor Guido or to pity her for having to. While the two chatted, the rest of the room buzzed with scattered conversation. 20-something people made it sound like 100. Bang! A sudden, loud noise startled everyone. Saul looked toward the sound and saw a second-rank apprentice walking in with a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Kelly gasped beside him. Even Saul sat up straighter, frowning. Because the one who had just entered was Lockeye, the same one who had given them their introductory lesson as freshmen. Using the Mutual Aid Society as a front, Lockeye had parasitized who knows how many newcomers. Saul didn't know his true agenda, but he was certain Lockeye was no simple, good guy. They had already mentally filed Lockeye under the evil faction. But Lockeye didn't say a word after entering. He simply pulled up the chair at the front podium and laid down a soft fur cushion. "Someone else is coming, and that's the one conducting the test." Saul quickly turned to the door. Sure enough, a few seconds later, A thin, pale man walked in slowly. He wore a loose, white robe, and his exposed hands were bony and skeletal. His footsteps were completely silent. If he hadn't been so short, Saul might have thought it was Big Pink making a grand entrance. Saul had never seen him before, but someone had. Kelly whispered a reminder. That's Mentor Ans. He specializes in earth and wood magic, but he also dabbles in water and poison, and I heard he's even studied light magic. He's got the most students in the entire tower. Lakai is one of them. Chapter 68, Out, Out, Out. When Lakai walked in, some people still greeted him warmly. But the moment Anne stepped inside, even the most talkative apprentices lowered their heads and fell silent. Had Saul and Kelly been sitting up front, they probably wouldn't have dared to whisper to each other either. Everyone, including Lakai, had their full attention on Anne's. They watched as he strolled slowly up to the lectern. With Lakai attending to him, Anne sat steadily on the chair, just like a man on the brink of death. Since the other mentors are all occupied today, my mentor Ans will be conducting the tests for everyone, Lakai cheerfully introduced to the group, not at all bothered by Anne's look of boredom and impatience behind him. No need to be nervous. Just try your best and show what you can do, Lakai continued to reassure the newcomers. That's enough, Mentor Ans cut him off in a low voice. Lakai wasn't the least bit embarrassed. He immediately shut his mouth and stepped aside respectfully, still wearing a faint smile. Ans leaned against the armrest of his chair, eyes sweeping across the classroom without pausing on anyone in particular. Testing one by one is such a hassle, he curled his lip. If you don't meet my standards, leave right now. The classroom grew even quieter. Saul and Kelly stopped talking, exchanging a silent glance. A few especially nervous apprentices were breathing so loudly it seemed deafening. Those who still haven't learned composite runes, out. Anne's voice, pale and feeble like his appearance, was like a needle stabbing straight into everyone's ears. Saul tilted his head slightly, not because he was weak, but because he could sharply sense the mental force embedded in that voice. It was firm and merciless. A few seconds later, two trembling apprentices stood up, despair written on their faces, and walked out. As soon as they stepped out, the classroom door slammed shut behind them, leaving everyone wondering what would become of them. Before the newcomers could even catch their breath, Anne spoke again. Those who can only construct a single composite rune, out. This time the pause was longer, about 10 seconds, before two more stood up in panic. They looked like they wanted to explain, but under Anne's intimidating presence, not a word came out. Another two left. Again the door slammed shut. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. That ordinary classroom door now felt like the boundary between life and death. Crossing it meant no return. But Mentor Ans wasn't done. Those who haven't yet learned a zero-tier spell, out. Even with the oppressive presence of a mentor, the room erupted in murmurs. Some couldn't believe their ears. They hoped Ans would take back what he said. But Ans merely stared coldly at them. Moments later, about half of the newcomers stood up. They looked around in confusion, glancing skeptically at the ones who remained seated. It was as if they were saying, "Didn't you say it was too hard? Didn't you say you didn't know how to do it either?" Mentor, one of the newcomers started, trying to appeal to Ans on behalf of the group. But before Ans could so much as blink, Lakai smiled and tapped the apprentice with a finger. The poor guy didn't even realize something was wrong. He opened his mouth to keep talking, only for something to fall out. Those nearby looked down. It was half a tongue. That did it. Everyone lowered their heads and quickly walked out, no longer daring to pause or protest. Saul, who'd been watching it all, actually leaned back in his chair and relaxed. This is just intimidation, he thought. If the test were really this strict, Ans could have just said, Only those who know a spell stay. He's clearly trying to scare us into working harder, huh? But Anne still wasn't finished. Anyone who only knows one zero-tier spell out. Silence. No one moved. Because in this entire room, barely anyone knew more than one tier 0 spell. That condition would eliminate almost everyone. The pause dragged on. Finally, Lockeye clapped his hands with a bright smile to get everyone's attention. Come on now, let's move quickly. The mentor's time is very valuable. Only then did the apprentices stand up one by one, hesitating, reluctant, glancing back as they filed out. They looked around, hoping no one passed the test either. That way, Mentor Ans might relax the standard, and they, the last batch eliminated, might have a shot at being let back in. But to their dismay, there were still 3 people sitting in their seats. Seriously, even that Saul guy was still there. Wasn't he the one with terrible magic aptitude? Hadn't the mentors already given up on him? How was he still sitting there? How could he still be sitting there? Their stares burned into him like nails, but all Saul did was switch which leg he had crossed. Kelly, sitting beside him, looked relatively calm, but under the desk, her fists were clenched tight. The third person who remained seated was the real shock for Saul. Angela. Saul glanced at her. She looked a little pale, but unlike Kelly, didn't seem especially nervous. He rubbed his left hand and switched legs again. The stunned newcomers filed out one by one. Once the last person left, the door closed firmly behind them again. Only 3 left. Mentor Ann sounded dissatisfied. Newcomers these days, not a shred of urgency. He tapped his fingers lightly on the lectern and uttered a cold command. Lockeye marked the ones who left as disqualified. Deal with them. What? Lockeye, who'd still been smiling, suddenly widened his eyes. He basically shouted the doubt everyone was feeling. Mentor, really? All of them disqualified? Come on, there were some mutual aid society members in there who have been working so hard. Can't you give them one more chance? Anne snorted coldly. Seems like your mutual aid group is that useful after all. Better disband it before it causes trouble. But Lockeye wasn't intimidated by Anne's attitude. He kept pleading on behalf of the students, his words smooth and sweet. Handle it however you want, just stop bothering me. Anne's finally relented, clearly annoyed. Hearing that, Saul and Kelly exchanged a glance, both feeling uneasy. If Lockeye now got to decide who passed the test, then the influence of the mutual aid group would grow even stronger. Could this whole thing have been a setup? Could Ans and Lockeye be putting on a 2-man act? Could it be that the real leader of the mutual aid group is a mentor? In a relatively small wizard tower, a true wizard secretly building a newcomer group, what could the motive be? Fame, wealth, or magical materials? Lockeye, cheerful after receiving Anne's orders, left to go calm down the little chicks outside. Meanwhile, Ans turned his gaze back to the 3 apprentices left in the room. His eyes landed on Angela, who was sitting alone in the corner. You come here, show me the spells you know. Though Angela looked uneasy, she moved decisively and walked straight up to him without hesitation. Mentor Ans, I'm Angela. I know 2 0-tier spells. Her voice was so soft that Saul almost didn't catch it. Under Anne's signal, Angela cast both spells. They were both of the shadow element, type Saul hadn't even seen before. The spells didn't seem to have much combat power. Saul wondered why Angela had chosen to learn these 2 first. Ans tapped his fingers twice on the desk. Saul noticed Angela's hands, clasped behind her back, twitch sharply. Light suppression and wraith detection. Not much for combat, but they're easy to pick up, and just enough to meet my minimum standard. Did someone in your family used to work at the tower? Chapter 69, Invitation. Hearing Anne's question, Angela bowed respectfully and replied, Yes, my uncle was once a second-rank apprentice here. He returned to his hometown when he was 30, and it was my uncle who told me about some unwritten rules in the tower. Upon hearing that Angela's background was only that of a second-rank apprentice, Anne's immediately lost interest in probing further. Although you're being a bit clever, a qualification is a qualification, Anne said, raising his hand to point at the name tag on Angela's chest. The name tag flickered briefly before returning to its normal state, with no visible changes. Angela still maintained a humble expression, bowing respectfully once more to thank Anne's. However, as she turned to leave the door, Saul noticed her mouth twitching in a suppressed manner. Next, Anne's gaze shifted to Saul and Kelly. Angela sat on the far left of the classroom, and Saul was seated to Kelly's left. By normal order, Saul should be next. But Anne skipped over Saul and called Kelly first. "Girl, come here." Kelly clenched her fists tightly under the table, then suddenly released them. With steady steps, she walked up to Anne's and, without further introduction, immediately performed 3 spells. All 3 were gold attribute, 0-tier spells. One was an attack spell, another a defense spell, and the third one was an enchantment spell. "You're Kelly, the one following Guido." Anne surprisingly knew her name. "Yes, Master Anne's," Kelly responded. "He did pick up a good apprentice, but unfortunately I haven't dealt much with gold attribute spells," Anne said, offering a subtle compliment. He acknowledged Kelly's performance and nodded at her name tag before letting her leave. Now only Saul and Anne's remained in the classroom. "Do I still need to call you?" Anne's asked. "Just call me Dad," Saul thought to himself, trying to ease the nervous tension inside. After all, unlike Kelly, who had been a victim of the Mutual Aid Society, Saul had just killed 3 of their new members. If Anne's truly was the boss behind the Mutual Aid Society, would he seize the opportunity to deal with him? Even if Anne's didn't go so far as to kill him because of the tower's rules, a teacher could still easily make things difficult for an apprentice. Saul quickly walked up to Anne's, preparing to finish the process just like Kelly had. But Anne's raised his hand to stop him. "Extend your left hand, let me see." It wasn't surprising that a teacher would notice something unusual about Saul's left hand. Saul raised his left hand, which had been concealed until only the tips of his fingers were visible, up to his chest. Anne's glanced at it briefly and nodded. "Your mind is sharp, you're brave, and you have good luck. No wonder you were able to kill Seed." Was this what he was after? Saul, together with Concha and Byron, had set up a trap for Seed, turning him into a new guest for the morgue. Knowing he couldn't keep this hidden, Saul decided to admit it and defend himself. "Master, I acted in self-defense and was forced to kill him." Anne's, hearing this, smiled lazily. "Self-defense?" He absent-mindedly traced circles on the table with his finger. "Don't worry, I won't care whether it was self-defense or not. Seed wasn't my apprentice. If anyone should be worried, it's you, not me. You should be worried about Rum. He's Seed's master. Once he sobers up, he might make you go see him." Mentor Rum. Rum was also one of the 5 instructors, specializing in water attribute magic. "Could you help explain it to him, Mentor?" "I really had no choice," Saul asked politely, although he had already figured out that Anne's was the type to avoid trouble, or at least appear that way. "Unexpectedly." "Sure," Anne smiled lightly and waved his finger at Saul. "If you become my apprentice, I can help you resolve this issue." Could Saul even change his instructor in the tower? But no matter what reason he gave to change instructors, it would be hard to avoid offending his current master. Besides, instead of switching masters, he could just go directly to Master Kaz to resolve the trouble. "Thank you, Master Anne's, but my current instructor treats me well. I can't bear to leave him," Saul responded cautiously, making sure not to offend Anne's. "Treat you well. He hasn't told you that you're surrounded by vengeful spirits. Vengeful spirits. Saul immediately raised his eyes, shocked. Don't look at me. You should go find Master Rum. He's best at dealing with vengeful spirits. If he still has the time to help you, Anne said, leaning back with his eyes half closed and his hands crossed over his stomach, tapping quickly. You don't want to switch to me. Fine, testing is finally over. What a hassle. Saul reminded Anne's. Master, I haven't cast my spells yet. Cast what? You've already killed a second rank. What more do you need to show? But Master Anne's, you haven't marked my name tag yet. Saul hesitated, unsure how to describe the action. A mark, perhaps. Anne's didn't move but closed his eyes and spoke. Saul, do you know why we conduct frequent tests here in the tower? Saul had no idea. The structure of the wizard tower is such that it will try to extract the maximum potential from everyone. If one day you realize you've been given more responsibility, don't be too happy. You've simply been placed in a position that suits your current abilities. Anne stopped speaking, almost as if he were asleep. Saul knew this meant it was time for him to leave the classroom. But Anne still hadn't marked any of the name tags. Was he deliberately making it difficult for him, or was he just annoyed that Saul wouldn't switch to being his apprentice? Saul bowed to Anne's closed eyes and left the room. As he pushed open the classroom door, Saul was startled by what he saw. The hallway outside was packed with over 20 people. Even Lockeye stood at the front of the crowd. When Lockeye saw Saul come out, he wasn't surprised at all. In fact, he cheered loudly. Come on, let's all congratulate the top performer of this test. With that, he led the applause. Kelly immediately joined in. But aside from Kelly, no one else in the hallway clapped. The apprentices stared at Saul, some in disbelief, others with cold indifference, and some with faces full of fear. Lockeye and Kelly's applause continued, creating an awkward symphony in the hallway. Gradually, Angela started clapping, followed by the uneasy does, then the fifth, sixth. Finally, everyone in the hallway began to clap, and the atmosphere slowly became strange but energetic. That's right, Tilda, Lockeye clapped while nodding happily. We should help each other, as we all entered the tower together, he. The applause lasted for about 3 minutes. Lockeye finally raised his hand to signal everyone to quiet down. Also, as a reward for first place, you can go to the garden and pick a companion flower to cultivate. So the first place has a reward, Saul thought to himself, feeling a little happier than the earlier applause. A garden, companion flowers. When he was a servant, he was always threatened by the housekeeper that if he didn't do his work well, he'd be dragged off to be used as fertilizer for the flowers. Now, he was going to see flowers nourished by that fertilizer. He had a bad feeling about it. At that moment, Lockeye suddenly leaned in, bending down with an excited look as he gazed at Saul. I don't even know your name yet. You haven't joined the Mutual Aid Society, have you? How about joining now? Although you're first among this group of apprentices, there are many seniors and upperclassmen in the Mutual Aid Society who are much more powerful than. Chapter 70, Big Pink and Another Second Rank. Kelly, who had been standing behind Saul the whole time, suddenly reached out like lightning and gave the back of Saul's waist a sharp twist. Hiss! It was the sound of a quick, sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth. Saul instantly understood. Kelly was reminding him to choose his words carefully. If he spoke too modestly, they might assume he was just being humble and forcefully drag him into the group. If he came off too arrogant, he might end up offending Rocky, who had invited him in front of everyone. In that split second, 3 or 4 possible excuses flashed through Saul's mind. Thanks to the diary's long-term training, he quickly chose the most appropriate one. Just as Saul was about to open his mouth, a low, hoarse voice rang out from behind the crowd. Testing done, now scram. What are you all loitering around for? Got nothing better to do. Everyone turned their heads quickly. It was Mentor Kaz. Weren't the mentors all supposed to be busy? Lock eyes, I twitched. Kaz's gaze swept past the crowd of pale mushrooms and landed squarely on Saul at the center. Saul, come with me. Yes, Mentor, Saul responded loudly. As he passed Rocky, he gave him an apologetic smile before walking away at a brisk pace. With Kaz leading the way, they walked toward the ramp on the 10th level and kept going upward. They passed the 15th level and reached the 16th. Saul's eyelid twitched. The 16th and 17th levels were where the mentors lived. He had only ever been to the 15th level, Kaz's lab. Mentor, where are we going? Saul asked, already forming a guess. Could it be that Kaz knew he had passed the test in first place and was taking him to see Big Pink? To meet a mentor. You probably haven't seen them before, Mentor Rum, who specializes in water and light magic. What? Saul's heart immediately skipped a beat. So they say, you beat up the junior and now the elder comes knocking. He had just learned this mentor's name, and now they'd already shown up. Mentor, why are we going to see Mentor Rum? Saul asked cautiously. What do you think? Kaz replied without turning his head. Saul looked at Kaz's aged figure ahead. Could it be Kaz was stepping in to smooth things over for him, to prevent Rum from taking revenge later? Or was Big Pink pulling strings behind the scenes? So when Big Pink said you're already strong enough, he really meant, go for it, I've got your back. That thought made Saul's heart start thumping wildly again, a boldness not his own surging inside him. As they rounded a corner of the ramp and were about to enter the 16th level, two people suddenly came walking down from the level above. Kaz and Saul paused at the intersection. Leading the pair was a woman with shoulder-length golden hair and sharp, striking features, appearing to be in her mid to late 20s. She wore a set of half-armor decorated with interwoven gold and white patterns. A court rapier hung at her waist, and her long boots had metallic tips that clacked with every step. Saul keenly noticed that as the woman approached, Kaz flinched slightly. An old acquaintance, an arch-rival. Before Saul could think further, the second person came into view. This one wore a reddish-brown cloak, the hood pulled low, revealing only a pink chin. The rest of their body was hidden beneath the cloak, save for a glimpse of a black shoe tip as they walked. A pink chin. Saul instantly knew who the second person was. But his first reaction was to lower his head and step aside, even hiding slightly behind Kaz. Kaz obligingly moved to shield part of Saul's body. As the pair passed by, Kaz bowed deeply. Tower Master Lady Kira. To warrant a 90-degree bow from a true wizard, the person had to at least be a second-rank wizard, or someone of equal standing. Saul also bowed deeply. He had intended to stay bowed until the pair passed, but the metal-tipped boots stopped right in front of Kaz. So many years and you've made no progress at all, said the woman, her voice rasping. Are you even trying to do your job? This time, Saul clearly saw Kaz's arm tremble. His mentor was afraid. Standing right beside Kaz, Saul felt no pressure from the woman, but he still pressed his chin tight against his collar. In the quiet hallway, Saul heard the man behind the woman chuckle. Kira, you're meddling a bit much. That voice, it was Big Pink. Saul remained bowed respectfully, but his mind raced. So Big Pink really is the Tower Master. Can he tell I'm haunted by a vengeful spirit? Will he help me? Still, Saul made sure not to move an inch. I'll wait for the Tower Master's instructions and pretend I don't know him. If even Senior Byron can't help me get rid of the spirit, then I'll. Kaz clearly feared the Tower Master. As for Saul, he didn't even have the right to speak here. But the woman Kira was clearly different. She tossed her head and glared at the Tower Master. All these years and you lot haven't made any progress. Gorsa, I've already reached second rank. Once I catch up to you, I'm taking her away. Tower Master Gorsa didn't get angry. He simply walked past Kira, leaving behind a breezy remark. Catch up to me first, then we'll talk. Kira snorted and quickly followed. Their figures soon disappeared around the bend. Kaz finally straightened up, his chest visibly rising and falling for a while. Saul turned to look in the direction the two had gone, slowly straightening as well. Mentor, so that was the Tower Master. That's the first time I've seen him. Kaz had calmed down. He glanced at Saul with a meaningful look. Yes, most people rarely see the Tower Master. Let's go. Saul had wanted to ask who the woman was, but figured Kaz wouldn't tell him anyway. They continued deeper into the 16th level. Halfway down the corridor, Kaz suddenly stopped again and turned to Saul, speaking in a low voice. If you ever encounter the Tower Master, you must always remain completely respectful. Don't mistake his gentle temperament for tolerance. Understand, he doesn't lose his temper not because he can't, but because he doesn't need to. Mentor Kaz is warning me. Saul instantly understood. So Kaz did know something, at least part of the truth, about Big Pink. Big Pink was the Tower Master. From now on, Saul would have to refer to him as Tower Master. I understand. Thank you, Mentor, Saul replied softly. Kaz was satisfied with Saul's earnest attitude, no false bravado. The Mentor's quarters occupied 2 entire levels of the tower. Even though the upper floors were smaller than the base, the rooms were still massive. The 16th floor had no luxurious decorations, no runes or magical arrays. Even the spacing of the torches and servant quarters was identical to the lower levels. Saul had expected to see something more mystical here, but it was as clean and plain as his own dorm room. They continued forward until Kaz stopped in front of a massive 3-meter-wide door. The door was nearly as wide as the hallway and designed as a folding door, not a push-pull one. Saul couldn't help but think, whoever needs a door like this must be huge. Could Mentor Rum be a fat guy? In front of the folding door stood 3 others besides Kaz and Saul. They were all golden-haired, blue-eyed, striking young men and women, dressed in identical robes, and each wearing a second-rank apprentice badge in the same spot on their chest. As Kaz approached, the trio simultaneously turned to the left, bowed in perfect sync, same angle, same pace. Kaz nodded slightly. They rose together, turned back in unison, and resumed standing silently. Here we go, here we go. Chapter 71, The Person Trapped on Her Back. Could it be that the 3 of them are actually the same person? Having seen many strange and unusual wizard apprentices, Saul speculated on the oddity of the trio before him. But he quickly realized he was wrong. The folding door cracked open slightly, and another blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy stepped out. He gave a nod to the girl at the front of the line. Then he turned and left. The boy who emerged was also wearing the same uniform, with the same second-rank apprentice badge pinned on it. The girl at the front of the line stepped through the narrow doorway, and Kaz seized the moment to lead Saul into the room. As soon as they entered, Saul instinctively glanced around for Mentor Rum's figure. The room was indeed spacious. Due to the size limitations of the wizard tower itself, it wasn't wide, but it was quite long. He said quite, because the sides of the room were lined with thick, heavy curtains that looked like they were made of leather. Each curtain panel was a meter wide, and the material was so thick it didn't sway. This room had no solid walls, only these curtain partitions. The girl apprentice who entered before them had already moved to the right, lifting one of the curtains. Saul leaned slightly to peek into the adjacent room. And then he saw a beam of light slanting down onto the floor. Saul blinked, feeling like this light was different from regular candlelight. A strange tension rose in him, but not because of the imminent appearance of Mentor Rum. Rum, Kaz didn't recklessly barge into the left or right spaces, but simply raised his voice and called. HMPH, came a response from the right, though the tone didn't sound particularly welcoming. Hey, Kaz raised his hand, motioning for Saul to follow. The two of them passed through the spot the previous apprentice had gone through, lifting the curtain into the next room. The moment Saul stepped through, he felt the temperature rise slightly compared to the rest of the building. He instinctively looked toward the source of the warmth and saw it, sunlight. His eyes welled up with tears. In the outer wall, a 1-meter square window had been built into the thick stone. The pitch-black window was open outward, and because of the wall's depth, only a small portion jutted beyond the outer surface. It was that single beam of light, piercing the heavy exterior wall like it had crossed galaxies, slanting onto the floor and bringing an unfamiliar warmth to the otherwise icy room. Saul hadn't seen sunlight in over 3 months. There'll be other chances, he sighed softly to himself, willing the overflowing tears back into his eyes. He quickly sped up to catch up with Mentor Kaz ahead. A few steps later, there was only a faint mist left in his eyes. Even as he passed through the light and felt its warmth on his skin, he kept his composure. Mentor Rum was seated deep in the room, and as Saul crossed the beam of sunlight he saw an enormous mound of flesh. He had seen pictures and videos of people weighing hundreds of pounds before. Many were so obese they couldn't even move from their beds. But even those didn't compare to this. This was truly a mountain of flesh. It seemed to be a man, though layers of fat obscured all visible gender characteristics. His mid-length, messy blonde hair hung to his jaw, propped up by the fat beneath his chin. He had no beard, and his nose was sunken into the fat of his cheeks. Only the area around his eyes was relatively flat. His most prominent feature was his stomach. Layers and layers of fat piled upon each other so thoroughly, it was impossible to tell where his chest ended and his abdomen began. His legs were completely hidden beneath folds of flesh like a bloated skirt. But his arms were strangely thin, extending from his shoulders to a length of nearly 2 meters. They were divided into 3 segments, clearly not human limbs. Was this Rum? The mound of flesh ignored Kaz and Saul as they entered, using those abnormally long arms to grope over the body of the girl who had entered before them. The apprentice remained expressionless, allowing herself to be inspected. There was no lewd atmosphere here. Rum's expression was one of scrutiny and criticism, like someone examining a head of cabbage at the market for rotten leaves. Go lie on the platform. The girl was finally released and walked over to a narrow, cold metal table beside Rum. She began undressing. Under her robe, she wore no shirt, though her pants were still properly on. No one in the room looked away. Even Saul kept watching silently. He had seen plenty of exposed female corpses in the morgue, but this was his first time seeing a living one. The apprentice undressed without hesitation, seemingly unbothered by the presence of others. She revealed her upper body, then quietly lay down on the metal slab, parting her golden hair to expose her pale back. Rum extended one of his long arms and gently pressed her back. A golden rune array suddenly emerged in the center of her pale skin. Intricate symbols were interwoven with lines and ancient Noah characters. It was Saul's first time seeing such a formation, and he couldn't help but examine it more closely. Then, all of a sudden, the golden runes shifted rapidly, forming the shape of a man's face, with rune-formed eyes that turned to stare directly at Saul. Saul immediately lowered his gaze and looked away. In doing so, he missed the unexpected glance Rum cast his way. Soon, Rum completed his examination, waved the girl off, and let her get dressed and leave. Not bad. Next. The apprentice still wore a blank expression, showing no emotion. Once she had left, Rum sighed softly. Then he quickly composed himself and looked at Saul standing behind Kaz, though he spoke to Kaz. "This is the one you recommended. He killed my lab assistant. Why would you think I'd agree to take him?" "Because he's suitable," Kaz replied with a shrug. "Suitable, a novice apprentice. What do you think he knows?" "He can learn," Kaz replied indifferently. Rum let out a short, scoffing laugh. "How long will that take? You think I have time to waste on him?" Kaz remained unfazed. "So what if it wastes time? Haven't we wasted enough time already?" Seeing that Kaz wasn't in the mood for arguing, Rum actually softened his tone a little. "You've seen Kira." "You mean Lady Kira. She's advanced to second rank." "A second-rank wizard." Rum sounded a bit surprised, then dazed. "She's already advanced. I might not ever reach that level in my life." Kaz didn't respond, silently acknowledging Rum's sentiment. The room fell into a brief silence. After a while, the sound of a second male apprentice entering the room broke the stillness. Rum snapped back to attention and said to Kaz, "You can go now. I need to test him. If he fails, I'll let him crawl back out alive." Kaz hesitated for a moment. He looked back at Saul as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just patted Saul on the shoulder and walked out. Saul hadn't expected that. Wasn't Mentor Kaz going to explain the situation with Seed? Or did he think that as long as Rum didn't kill him, letting Saul suffer a bit and be done with it was good enough? Rum's cold gaze swept over him, making Saul feel like he had been stripped bare. The second male apprentice had already walked up to Rum. Rum, clearly disinterested, casually groped him a couple of times and told him to lie on the metal bed. "Observe carefully. I'll ask you questions afterward." "Observe, are you talking to me?" Still not fully grasping the situation, Saul saw that Rum had begun, and hurriedly slipped into a semi-immersed meditative state. This was his serious work attitude. From his perspective this time, the golden glyphs on the male apprentice's back appeared again, quickly forming the image of a woman's head. Saul resisted the discomfort and kept watching the glyphs' changes, carefully analyzing each rune's function. But most of the formation was composed of compound runes, some of which he had never even seen before. After watching for a while, he still only understood bits and pieces. Then suddenly, a white, semi-transparent human head lunged out of the formation. But it seemed to be held back by some kind of force, as if something were pulling it inward. Its facial features, stretched to the limit by the backward force, looked almost exactly like the golden rune-formed woman's face. Chapter 72, The Second Olive Branch. What was that? A soul sealed inside the body. Just as the head was about to break free from the body, the golden runes suddenly transformed into layers of chains, sealing the 7 orifices of the head and forcefully pulling it back. The head gradually ran out of strength and was about to be dragged back into the male apprentice's body by the golden rune chains. Suddenly it recoiled swiftly, then darted straight toward Saul. In the moment of pulling and resistance, a narrow gap opened, and a torn, hoarse cry came from the tightly clenched lips of the head. "Help me!" The golden rune chains tightened once again, and the voice was abruptly cut off. It seemed that one cry for help had exhausted the head's last bit of strength. The golden rune chains finally succeeded in dragging it back into the male apprentice's back. Rum let out a soft hum, then suddenly reached to the side and picked up a large quill pen from the lab bench. He dipped the tip into an ink bottle the size of a thumbprint. When he lifted it, a drop of slightly viscous golden liquid clung stubbornly to the tip. Rum moved quickly, adding a few more lines to the male apprentice's back. The apprentice twitched twice and his face, turned to the side, twisted in pain. But because of this change, he looked more like a living person than a puppet. As the rune formation was gradually reinforced, the apprentice's face returned to calm once again. Saul, who had been observing silently, also stopped meditating. Once he was done drawing, Rum tossed the quill back onto the table, made the male apprentice stand up, and re-examined his body. Watch him for a while longer, send him out, bring in the next one. The third apprentice came in next, and this time nothing abnormal happened. The process went quickly, as if just going through the motions. Once all three apprentices had left, Rum stood in place, deep in thought for a moment. Then he suddenly beckoned Saul over. Saul walked over with some nervousness, unsure of how Rum was going to test him. But to his surprise, the first thing Rum said after grabbing his shoulder was, "Have you been having nightmares these past 2 days?" In Saul's mind, he instantly saw that naked figure lying on the teleportation platform, the sound of footsteps searching for him, and the pitch-black void beneath the platform. Mentor Ans had said he was haunted by a vengeful spirit. Could the nightmares be a manifestation of that? But then why hadn't Mentor Kaz noticed anything? "Yes," Saul replied, showing an appropriate amount of unease. "Seed's vengeful spirit is latched onto you. Seems like you gave him a pretty stifling death." "I was defending myself, like forced to strike back," Saul hurried to explain. Rum let out a hearty laugh, his neck stretching forward unnaturally long. "Well then, do you want me to help you get rid of Seed's spirit?" Saul froze for a moment before he realized what Rum meant. Internally, he thought, "Rum, are you Seed's mentor or mine? Did you mix up who the enemy is here?" This guy had just been complaining that Saul killed his assistant, and now he was offering help. Though he found it strange, Saul was usually an honest person. "I do." Rum was very pleased with Saul's decisiveness. "Good, then perform well. Kaz says you have an exceptional soul aptitude. He rarely uses the word exceptional for anyone. Let me see how good you really are. Now tell me, what did you see in those 3 second-rank apprentices?" Saul paused, organizing his thoughts, then truthfully described everything he had seen. Rum stared at him intently, and as Saul spoke, Rum's expression grew increasingly serious. "This isn't just aptitude, it should be called soul intuition." He extended a hand, grabbed Saul's arm and spun him around in place. Then he retracted his hand and laid it over his own belly. His belly rippled like a lake disturbed. "Despite your lack of knowledge in formations and runes, and your shallow understanding of wizardry, you can pierce through the surface and grasp the essence directly." Suddenly, Rum curled his 5 fingers inward and violently yanked, tearing a chunk of flesh straight from his stomach. There was no blood from the wound. Instead, fat oozed out and sealed the opening. Rum began kneading the flesh in his hand. The lump of flesh turned out to be malleable like clay. A doll-like figure quickly took shape in Rum's hands. Then he dipped his pinky into a bottle and hooked out 2 black, loach-like worms, placing them on the doll's face. The loaches wriggled into the eye sockets, leaving 2 empty holes. After that, the doll slowly changed color, turning into a light brown wooden shade. Wasn't this the same kind of puppet the apprentices used to test their mental strength? Only now did Saul realize that the puppets weren't made of wood at all. He'd even borrowed one to study for days and never noticed the material was fake. Rum tossed the newly made eyeless puppet into Saul's hands. "Stare into it and tell me what you hear." Saul glanced at Rum with suspicion, but still obeyed. He lowered his head and locked eyes with the puppet's hollow sockets. Help me, I want to help me." The pleas began again, sometimes mixed with other voices. As time passed, Saul's face gradually turned pale. Soon he could no longer focus on the puppet's eyes, yet couldn't tear his gaze away. This freshly made puppet seemed even stronger and more terrifying than the one stored in the cabinet. Rum said nothing, and made no move to stop the process. "Kill me, kill me, kill me." The sharp, screaming voice returned. Saul immediately felt his eardrums ache, his brain spinning inside his skull. He thought Rum would finally stop it, but the latter still didn't react. Saul's mental strength had grown since he became an apprentice, but not by much. Once again, his vision darkened, and he was on the verge of fainting. Finally, the puppet was taken from his hands. The sharp screaming instantly ceased. Saul's knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed. He barely caught himself in time to stay upright. Wait, what had he just touched? He quickly withdrew his hand. Any slower, and it would have sunk into Rum's flabby flesh. Rum didn't seem to notice Saul's small gesture. He casually tossed the puppet into a nearby wooden barrel and asked, "What did you hear?" Saul took a deep breath. His brain felt like it had melted into mush. At first, someone was calling for help, saying, "Help me." Rum showed no reaction. Saul went on. Then there were other voices, saying things like "me too" or "it hurts." Rum nodded slightly, about to speak, only for Saul to continue. Then finally there were some sharp screams, "Kill me." As he recalled the sound, Saul wrapped his arms around himself, his skin breaking out in goosebumps. Rum was just about to nod when his expression suddenly changed. He reached out and clamped down tightly on Saul's right arm. "What did you hear last? Kill me." A sharp pain shot through Saul's arm, accompanied by a cracking sound. His face twisted in agony, and he cried out, "This Rum really is trying to get back at me." But in the very next second, a white light flashed. Saul's right arm was fully restored. The pain vanished as if it had been an illusion, and even the headache eased considerably. "You really heard 'kill me'?" Rum's eyes and fat-covered face twitched violently. "Yes," Saul said, holding his arm, which was thankfully unharmed. "Was it a man's voice or a woman?" "A woman." Seeing how much Rum cared about the voice, Saul added another descriptor. "She sounded like she was in terrible pain." Rum stared at Saul, his expression dazed, as if he were seeing someone else in Saul's face. He suddenly burst into wild laughter, like he was having a seizure. Both hands slapped his enormous belly repeatedly, producing a thump-thump sound in sync with his laughter. He laughed so hard he doubled over, his body barely moving while his head rocked back and forth. Saul watched nervously, taking 2 cautious steps back. He was afraid Rum might actually explode like an overinflated balloon. Rum laughed for a full 10 minutes before swaying forward and abruptly stopping. He stared at Saul with intense focus. "Do you want to transfer under me?" Chapter 73, First Glimpse at Career Planning. Having just witnessed the death swing firsthand, Saul really wanted to shake his head. He couldn't understand why he had suddenly become such a hot commodity today. What exactly was the value of a soul-related talent that made both Ans and Rum, 2 people he was meeting for the first time, extend their olive branches? Still, thinking back to Big Pink, now more appropriately called Tower Master Gorsa, it seemed that he too had taken an interest in Saul because of this very soul-related aptitude. That thought helped Saul steady himself a little. Naturally, he wasn't going to switch allegiances so easily, especially after killing Seed, Rum's once trusted aide. Who knew whether, once he lost his value, they'd come to settle that old score. And yet, Rum's offer seemed a lot more sincere than Ann's. Seeing Saul remain silent, Rum reached behind him and pulled out a few sheets of paper, his eyes scanning the text. "Actually, before Kaz brought you here, I had already looked over your file and spoken with the person who did your initial evaluation." Rum gave a wry smile and gave the sheets a light shake. He held them up with 2 slender fingers, showing them to Saul. "Your test results were very strange." Saul looked at the words in front of him. Saul, family unknown, likely none. Age 12. Mental perception, low-mid scattered. Suggested majors, dark light. Mental aptitude, high specific level requires further evaluation. Magical aptitude, likely low, testing unavailable due to fainting, assumed to be unnecessary given high mental aptitude. Overall assessment, aptitude low mid, no, crossed out, some potential for training, possibly suitable for specific special roles. Approved. Back then, in order to pass the test, Saul had taken the risk of pushing his mental energy to the limit, so much that he passed out. He had no idea whether that helped, but the diary had said doing so would let him survive. It was already his turn. He had no time to think, he had to gamble. Saul had never really understood how exactly he passed the test. Now it seemed that the person who wrote the evaluation hadn't planned to approve him at first, but then, for some reason, changed their mind. Rum noticed the way Saul was studying the page and gently flicked the stack of papers. The top sheet fluttered down, revealing the one underneath. It was another evaluation report. And it was also for Saul. Saul family unknown, likely none. Age 10. Mental perception, low-mid scattered. Suggested majors, light earth. Mental aptitude, mid. Magical aptitude, low. Overall assessment, poor aptitude not worth cultivation. Rejected. Recommended reassignment as servant. Saul's eyes slowly widened. The paper dropped away and Rum's large face moved in closer. So, can you explain how a servant's mental aptitude jumped from mid to high in just 2 years? With Rum's gaze boring into him, Saul felt like something was squeezing his brain. His thoughts were stiff, frozen. His mouth opened involuntarily, but it took a few seconds before any sound emerged. I don't know. Rum. After speaking the first words, Saul found his head clearing somewhat. He shook off the fog and gave Rum an innocent look. Mentor Rum, I really don't know. Maybe they just got it wrong back then. Rum's face froze for a second, then he shot Saul a glare. Saul quickly added, actually, it's like this. I once accidentally offended your student, Senior Seed. He really had stumbled upon Seed, looking for something in the library. He beat me within an inch of my life. Actually, he had beaten him to death. Within an inch was putting it lightly. My head was bleeding all over. And his life ended. When I woke up, aside from basic life skills, I couldn't remember much from before. Because he had crossed over from another world. So I really don't know. That part at least was the truth. His sincerity seemed to give Rum pause. Rum found himself wondering, could a person's brain really evolve after severe trauma? Was it worth testing this theory somehow? Meanwhile, Saul was blinking innocently, while thinking to himself, did my mental aptitude skyrocket because I crossed over? I remember in some novels, it's said that the soul of someone who's traveled through time and space becomes incredibly strong. So maybe mental strength is tied to the soul. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the red hardcover book slowly floating over his shoulder. Or is this all thanks to the diary? This was still a blind spot in Saul's knowledge, so he gave up guessing. Across from him, Rum didn't seem to come to any clear conclusion either. He simply tossed the last piece of paper to the floor. Well, that's not the point anyway. Rum leaned back, resting both hands on his round belly. It jiggled. It's clear from both evaluations that the attribute you should major in is light. Rum tapped his own chest. And the sorcery I specialize in just happens to be water and light. So light was the element he had the highest perception for. Saul finally understood. During the test, when that other senior had casually written down light, it was because that was his strongest affinity. But Saul clenched his left fist. After the body modification, he could now use the artificial skin, crafted from the plastic bone in his left arm, to enhance his sensitivity to dark element particles. If he were tested again now, dark would probably be his strongest element. He had already embarked down this path. Rum seemed to notice Saul's inner hesitation. He lightly tapped Saul's left hand with his fingertip. I can tell, after your body modification, your affinity with dark has grown considerably. Saul looked down at the pale gray tips of his fingers. They trembled slightly, and he withdrew them into his sleeve. Rum went on. It's fine to keep majoring in dark if that's your current direction, but you need to understand, what a wizard chooses as their primary attribute doesn't just affect the type of magic they learn. It also determines their future area of research and study. If you choose dark, you'll be working closely with corpses and ghosts for the rest of your life. If you choose light, it'll be more about energy and spirits. You're just a first-rank apprentice right now, the very beginning of your journey as a wizard. There's no need to rush into a lifelong decision just because you've made some early progress. Make your decision before you choose your locator. Of course, some wizards do change their primary attribute later on, but the road becomes much harder. Rum's thoughtful explanation had a real impact on Saul. It even caused a flicker of doubt to form in his heart. But then Saul heard that word, locator. The doubt vanished, replaced by certainty. With the diary of a dead wizard in his possession, how could he ever choose anything else as his locator? The diary's attribute, wasn't it obviously dark? Still, Saul didn't let his thoughts show. He put on a conflicted expression and asked Rum, "But weren't you angry earlier about me killing your assistant?" Rum gave him a cold, distant smile. That's because most wizards care far more about value than relationships or emotions. You passed my test, Saul. In fact, you exceeded my expectations. That's far more important than revenge or venting. Saul looked at Mentor Rum. The man met his gaze calmly. He probably wasn't lying, or didn't need to. Mentor Rum, may I ask, what exactly is a locator? Locator. Rum folded his long hands over his chest, fingertips touching, as if pondering how to answer. Locators are normally something second-rank apprentices learn about. But since your mental strength is already high enough, I'll give a simple example. Rum raised one finger and pointed toward the far end of the room. Saul turned around and saw he was pointing at the only window in the room. Sunlight still streamed in, quiet and warm. You were pretty moved just now when you saw real sunlight. It's true, first-rank apprentices rarely get the chance to go outside, so while you can, take a good look. Chapter 74, an example to explain what a locator is. Rum stretched out his hands toward the small window and began chanting an incantation. With a bang, the black window slammed shut, and the room immediately dimmed by several degrees. Then the window began to extend and expand, growing until it covered the entire outer wall of the room. Saul watched the transformation in front of him, momentarily forgetting to breathe. It was like opening a surprise gift box. The black window slowly tilted outward. Sunlight squeezed through the narrow crack, gradually widening, spilling in bit by bit, until it filled the whole room. Saul found the sunlight a little blinding, yet he couldn't bear to blink. Standing beside him, Mentor Rum said, "Go ahead, take a look." Saul dragged his feet cautiously toward the window. The scenery outside gradually came into view. In the distance, the sky was clear and blue like a washed canvas, with drifting clouds floating by. The sun hung at a slant above, and its halo made it hard for Saul to stare at it for long. Beneath the sky, dark mountain peaks stretched endlessly. Dense forests filled the valleys, reaching out toward the plains. Scattered villages and winding paths dotted the mountains and woods. The nearer area was smooth wilderness, open and empty, with no humans or livestock in sight. The world was peaceful, like a painting. "Hello, New World," Saul greeted it silently in his heart. Suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the tranquility. A black shadow flashed overhead, streaking into the distance. Saul looked up and saw a massive bird flying at incredible speed, cutting through wind and clouds. There even seemed to be a person standing atop the bird. This sudden change jolted Saul back to his senses. He was reminded once again that what lay before him wasn't a quiet countryside. It was a world of wizards and powerful forces beyond comprehension. "Beautiful, isn't it? Now take a closer look," came Rum's voice from behind. Saul's gaze slowly shifted downward. The deep green fields faded into blotchy patches, turning to brownish-yellow earth, then to scorched yellow, and finally into an interwoven mess of pitch black and mud. Looking down, just a few dozen meters below, was a bubbling swamp. Occasionally, bones or weeds would be churned up by the bubbles, only to be dragged back into the mire after a brief struggle. Several broken corpses floated on the surface. Some faced up, others down, and some with feet pointed skyward. They drifted slowly with the bubbling mud. Suddenly, a black, mud-covered tentacle emerged silently, coiling around one of the corpses and slowly dragging it downward. The corpse didn't resist, simply sinking back into the muck. As Saul watched the tentacle vanish, he felt a cold, slithering sensation brush across his skin, as if something reptilian had just touched him. Where exactly was Gorse's wizard tower located? Why was there a swamp full of corpses and monsters beneath it? The apprentices learning wizardly here, would they ultimately sink into the mire or soar above the clouds? The beauty and tranquility vanished. Doubts and fear crept into Saul's heart. Rum's voice came again. "Frightening, isn't it? Look down at your feet." At those words, Saul looked down and his pupils shrank sharply. At some point, he had stepped right to the edge of the black window. Most of his right foot was already hanging off. In the next second, he would have fallen, just another body floating in the swamp. Snapping back to his senses, Saul jerked his foot back and stumbled backward repeatedly, retreating until his back slammed into the wall at the far end of the room. Seeing Saul's frightened expression, Rum let out a low chuckle. He leaned forward, his bulk oozing toward Saul's feet, warm and clammy. He raised a hand and covered Saul's eyes. Beauty and terror both tempt you to fall into the abyss. The locator is like the black window. It supports your mental form when you lose your way. But keep in mind, a locator can only delay your collapse. In the end, you must sort out your own consciousness to wake up. When Rum lowered his hand again, the room had returned to normal. The wall-sized window was once again a 1-meter square pane of black glass, tilted inward, letting in a narrow beam of light. Saul had been truly shaken. He wasn't afraid of the distant mountains or soaring bird, nor even the corpses and bones in the swamp. What frightened Saul most was that he still didn't know how he had ended up stepping outside the window. In his memory, he had merely moved closer to the window. But this experience, combined with his earlier modification, gave Saul a deeper understanding of what a locator really was. A locator helped wizards remain aware of their own existence, so they wouldn't lose themselves in the known or unknown. But its power had limits. If one blindly relied on a locator and failed to control their own desires, eventually they would exceed the protection it could offer, ending up as a pile of flesh, or worse, something unrecognizable. Moreover, a locator was extremely private. If someone understood another person's locator well enough, they could potentially grasp that person's fatal weakness. For this reason, probing into someone's locator was a taboo. As Saul was still lost in these reflections, Rum murmured, "I personally explained half a lesson to you, even though you're not my student. Let's say that's worth 10 credits. Mentor, are you robbing me?" Saul's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Or you could work for me for 10 days. Saul's mouth promptly closed. So this was what it was all about. He thought back to the conversation between Kaz and Rum when Kaz first brought him here. They'd been discussing having Saul help out. Since that was the case, Saul didn't argue. He just needed to set one thing straight. Mentor Rum, I've only been studying for 3 months. I don't really know what I can do. At that, Rum glared at him. Now you remember you're a rookie. Look at the stunts you've been pulling. Do those look like rookie mistakes to you? His belly swelled and pulsed like a toad. Go to the second lab on the 14th floor. Find Nick. Oh, and tell him to deal with the vengeful spirit attached to you. That was serious business. Saul immediately stood at attention. Thank you, Mentor Rum. I'll head over right away. Wasting no time, he bowed respectfully and headed for the exit. Just as his hand touched the curtain, Rum's voice rang out again. Before you advance to a second-rank apprentice, give it some serious thought. Choosing a main attribute that doesn't suit you is a painful thing. Saul paused. Rum's words sounded personal. Could it be that Rum wasn't satisfied with his current field of research? Lifting the curtain, Saul stepped out, and just before leaving, he turned to glance back into the room. The lamps inside had been deliberately dimmed. Only a single shaft of light cut through. Mentor Rum, like a mountain of flesh, sat alone in the shadows. Everything seemed so indistinct. The heavy curtain soon stilled, blocking Saul's line of sight. After leaving Rum's room, Saul hurried toward the laboratory. He had already felt that the nightmare issue couldn't be delayed. If Mentor Rum hadn't helped today, he would have gone to Senior Byron or someone else. The good news was, from Rum's perspective, the Wraith wasn't a big deal. He didn't even bother dealing with it himself, just told an upperclassman to handle it. Hope this senior is easy to talk to, Saul thought quietly. He left Rum's room and made his way down the ramp. The mentor's floor was much quieter than the apprentice's level. The 3 second-rank apprentices who had been waiting outside were nowhere to be seen. Under the bright lamplight, the hallway felt cold and empty. A strange thought suddenly popped into Saul's mind. This wizard tower had trapped the servants and the apprentices. Had it also trapped others? Was the only truly free person the tower's master, Gorsa, whom Saul had once mockingly nicknamed Big Pink? When Saul saw the tower master earlier, the man had been completely wrapped in a reddish-brown cloak. Even the small part of his chin that was exposed was covered in pink silk bandages, just like always. Was someone like that really free? Chapter 75. Let's clear up the misunderstanding first. The West Tower dormitory, located in the apprentice safe zone, was still a danger zone for someone like Saul who used to be a servant. He often felt a faint sense of unease when walking through the dormitory at night. But the floor where the mentors lived didn't carry that eerie, dangerous feeling. Not at all. Was it because true wizards had much better control over their power, or had all the danger reached such a concealed level that it no longer leaked out? Saul reached the end of the hallway and looked up the sloped corridor. Mentor Kaz lived on the 17th floor. He rarely showed up in the laboratory or corpse chamber. Was he, like Mentor Rum, using his dorm as his true laboratory? As for the floors above 18, those were entirely the Tower Master's private domain. It was said that Tower Master Gorsa was a second-rank wizard, an extremely powerful one, nearly at the threshold of the 3rd rank. As for how strong exactly, no one could say. They only knew that all 5 mentors followed the Tower Master's orders without question. Second-rank wizards were still far beyond Saul's current reach. Thinking of the vengeful spirit on his body, Saul temporarily shelved his yearning for true wizardry and quickened his pace, leaving that floor behind. When Saul arrived at the second lab on the 14th floor, he saw the door was open. He walked up and peeked inside. This lab was much smaller than Mentor Kaz's. It didn't have rows of shelves filled with materials, but it did have many operating tables. The most eye-catching feature of the room was a high-backed metal chair with double armrests. A few thumb-thick cords dangled from beneath the chair. Directly across from the chair was an operating table, and behind it stood a man. With curly brown hair and a second-rank apprentice badge pinned to his chest, the man stood with a blank expression as he tended to something burning in a brazier. Wisps of greenish smoke rose from the brazier, sometimes dispersing, sometimes gathering, before finally vanishing into the ceiling. Afraid of interrupting an experiment, Saul didn't speak. If he startled the guy and caused him to mess up, and the man tried to pin it on him, that'd be bad. So Saul waited silently at the door, planning to enter only once he was noticed. But the moment Saul stopped walking, the man inside spoke up. "Why aren't you coming in? The door's open for you." "Senior Nick?" Saul asked cautiously. Nick looked up, green smoke curling around his face. "You remember me?" Saul didn't remember at all. He'd only just heard the name from Mentor Rum. "Oh, all right, seems you've forgotten." Nick lowered his head again, showing no sign of being upset. As if not being remembered was perfectly normal. "Come in and close the door. I'll explain some of the precautions here." Saul stepped in as instructed and stood beside Nick. Nick looked about 18 or 19, but his composed demeanor made him seem more like a 30-something uncle than Senior Byron. "I heard you work in the corpse chamber." "Yes, Senior." Nick nodded. "That's dealing with the dead. Here, we mostly deal with the living." He turned and looked at Saul. "I specialize in observing emotions. Most of the wizardry I'm studying also relates to emotions." He just revealed his specialty right off the bat. Saul's mind raced. That probably meant this would be important for the upcoming experiment, hence the advanced explanation. Manipulating emotions. Didn't sound that powerful. Was it even offensive? What makes someone cry or laugh to death? Wait a second. Saul suddenly looked up at Nick. He remembered who Nick was. He had dozens of bizarre causes of death listed in his diary, and one of them was death by laughter. Nick was the senior who'd sat beside Seed during the initial test for Saul's batch of newcomers. So back then, when he laughed to death, that was Nick's doing. He was also one of Seed's hidden trump cards. Nick continued calmly explaining, unaware that Saul was already reaching into his pocket. "Our experiments here mainly focus on observing spiritual entities, emotional states. The mentor appointed me to lead this part. He said you're good at directly observing spirits, so he sent you to assist. You seem agitated. Is something wrong?" Nick put out the fire. The green smoke gradually dissipated, leaving nothing behind in the brazier. "You were the senior who tested us that day." Saul subtly moved his left hand to the front of his body, while his right hand gripped a small bottle inside his pocket. "Yes." Nick put away the brazier and pulled out 2 sets of earmuffs from under the table. One he hung around his neck, and the other he handed to Saul. "Seed and I usually worked as partners, so when he took on the task of testing newcomers, I went with him." Saul accepted the earmuffs with his left hand, but didn't put them on. Nick was Seed's friend. His right thumb pressed against the body of the bottle. "Mentor Rum isn't planning to pursue what happened with Seed anymore," Saul said, hoping that Nick was rational enough not to make a move in the lab. But Nick was more rational than Saul expected. He set down the tools he was tidying, turned, and said, "You're still on edge, fine. So Seed doesn't become an obstacle to our future work, I should probably explain everything to you." Nick's expression remained flat, with no visible grief over Seed's death. "There's no need to bear hostility toward me. In a way, I actually saved your life." Saul still clutched the earmuffs and looked up at Nick. Seed was acting strangely that day. He had a bad temper and a sharp tongue, but it was still surprising when he suddenly killed a new apprentice. Nick recounted the events calmly. You see, one of the tower's rules is that everything here belongs to the tower master, so causing unnecessary loss may bring punishment. That's why I was shocked. If Seed had a problem with that chubby kid, he could have just demoted him to servant or killed him in secret. Why act so openly? Later, much later, after hearing you'd killed Seed, I realized it. Seed probably killed the fat kid just so he could use that as an excuse to kill you. At the time, you were just a reserve apprentice. Whether you lived or died, I didn't really care. And Seed even secretly urged me to kill you while you were unconscious, saying we wouldn't be punished for it. Nick looked down. Because those who haven't passed the test or been demoted to servants aren't technically tower property. I didn't notice you were a servant back then and nearly got talked into it. Seed was always good at exploiting loopholes in rules and people. Fortunately, I kept my cool. Nick nodded slightly, seemingly proud of himself. So Saul's death by laughter in his diary really was Nick's doing. Saul was grinding his teeth. Even though Seed was already dead, just realizing how many traps he'd laid back then made Saul furious. He wished he could kill the guy all over again. During the test, Saul had gone out of order because of his diary's guidance. He skipped the lowest magic talent test and prioritized the others, eventually fainting after confirming a high mental aptitude. Maybe Nick spared him out of appreciation for talent, or maybe he feared being punished for killing someone whose potential hadn't yet been confirmed. Nick declared that Saul had passed the test, foiling Seed's plan. All Seed could do was watch Saul become an apprentice, an asset of the Tower Master. If he wanted to kill Saul after that, he'd have to be far more discreet and take on greater risk. Saul was silent for a moment, then followed Nick's lead and hung the earmuffs around his neck. Thank you, Senior. If not for you, I might have failed the test, died on the spot, or been sent back to the servant quarters to be bullied. If Saul had returned to the servant area, whether it was the boys he'd intimidated or the stewards he'd mocked, they would never have let him live. It would have been a death sentence. Nick looked down at the work table, stroking the stubble on his chin with his free hand. Actually, the entrance test for apprentices doesn't strictly require passing all 3 aptitude tests. As long as someone's deemed worth cultivating, they can be accepted. So don't stress too much over your results. But one thing you must remember this. It was me who deemed you worth keeping alive. Saul nodded vigorously. He would remember it. Chapter 76, Feeling Good. It turns out I have a pretty good eye. No matter what your magic aptitude is, your high mental aptitude makes you capable of handling a lot of basic tasks. Nick made no effort to hide the fact he was praising himself, but there wasn't even a trace of smugness in his tone. Yeah, Senior Nick really does have a good eye, Saul thought to himself. Back then, he was also the one who saw at a glance that my strongest talent was sensing light elements. It wasn't just something I wrote down at random. Well then, now that we've reached an understanding, we can cooperate properly, right? Nick spread his hands toward Saul. Saul quickly replied, I'll do my best to assist you, Senior. Nick gave a slight nod, still expressionless, as if he was born without the ability to make facial expressions. We've wasted a bit of time. Let's jump straight into the experiment. We'll explain as we go. Subject 1, come in. Nick put on his headset, raised his voice slightly, and called toward the door. Saul turned around just in time to see the lab door open. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed female second-rank apprentice walked in, her face devoid of emotion. It was one of the apprentices Saul had seen in Rum's room earlier, who knew how long she'd been waiting outside. She stepped inside and stood across from Nick at the operating table, facing him directly. Neither of them showed any expression, perhaps more accurately, no emotion. Saul's eyes darted between them, wondering if there was some kind of relationship between the two. Don't look at me, Nick gestured to the girl but continued speaking to Saul. "I'm different from her. Their situation is not the same." Nick had the emotionless yet beautiful female apprentice sit in the metal, high-backed chair opposite them. As the slender girl sat down, the chair immediately began to transform. The tall backrest sank downward, and two metal rings extended from it, locking around her neck and waist. The armrests folded inward, perfectly supporting her forearms and locking her elbows and wrists in place. Even the chair's legs extended metal bands to clamp her ankles and knees. It looked like something designed for punishment. Nick motioned for Saul to follow and began teaching him how to use the metal chair. Behind and below the chair hung several cable-like cords, thin as embroidery needles at the tip. Once the girl was properly seated, Nick went over and began sticking the fine tips into places like her cheeks, wrists, and ankles. Though the cords looked heavy, the needle tips only pierced a few millimeters into her skin. When Nick let go, they didn't fall due to gravity but instead floated in place, as if they had a will of their own. Saul memorized each step, while thinking about when he should bring up the issue of resolving the vengeful spirit. The work had started too suddenly. He hadn't had the chance yet. The girl remained expressionless throughout, completely unreactive. Saul felt that even if Nick did something more horrifying to her, she wouldn't resist at all. Once they were done setting everything up, the two of them stepped back behind the operating table. Nick took out a metal disc made from the same material as the chair. Saul craned his neck forward to get a better look. The disc was divided into 4 quadrants by a cross, and each section was subdivided into a different number and shape of small compartments. "This is the electro-sense chair. This is the corresponding control panel," Nick explained. "The mechanism behind the control panel is complicated and classified knowledge. You don't need to worry about that. Just remember where each sensor wire was placed." After confirming that Saul remembered the setup process, Nick handed him some paper and a pen and had him sit beside him. "Usually, I record the emotional fluctuations of the test subject to perceive their response to the chair's stimuli. In a moment, you'll use your own method to record the subject's reactions." Nick casually tossed the control panel into the air and caught it. The panel suddenly lit up with a streak of blue electricity that flashed across its surface and then vanished. Saul instinctively retracted his plastic-boned fingers back into his sleeve. Electricity, the natural enemy of plastic bones. "I'm actually pretty curious why the professor sent you to record the subject's reactions. Did you awaken some strange gift?" Though Nick voiced curiosity, his eyes didn't move at all. It felt more like a polite inquiry. Before Saul could answer, Nick pressed the control panel. "We're starting." As Nick pressed various parts of the panel, different segments lit up. Corresponding to that, arcs of electricity traveled down the cords to the girl's body, and a faint scorched smell immediately began to waft from her. The girl's face twisted in pain. She tried to arch her back but was held immobile by the numerous restraints. Saul scanned her with his eyes first, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. It just looked like she was being electrocuted. Then he slipped into a semi-immersive meditative state. When Saul looked at the girl again, he was shocked to find a semi-transparent, pale male face superimposed on hers. The man's eyes were half-lidded, lips curled into a satisfied smirk. That face looked very similar to the one formed by the rune array on her back. "I'm picking up that subject one is currently feeling pleasure. Did you notice anything?" Nick asked without looking at the girl's pained expression, his focus fixed on the control panel. Saul stared at the translucent male face on the girl's face. "He's enjoying it." Nick blinked, turning to look at Saul. "That's a rather unusual way to put it. Can you describe it in more detail?" "It's like extreme comfort, total relaxation." Hearing this, Nick lowered his gaze to the panel, deep in thought. After a moment, he suddenly threw the control panel onto the table, bent over, and started scribbling rapidly. Meanwhile, the girl on the chair had twisted into such agony that her facial muscles contorted, drool dripping from the corner of her mouth. And the man's face on hers had begun to roll his eyes back in ecstasy. "Senior Nick, maybe turn the chair off for now," Saul suggested. Nick snapped back to awareness and finally noticed the girl's state, but instead of turning off the panel, he switched to a different stimulation mode. A new kind of silver arc danced along the cords. The girl's pained expression instantly vanished. Her body relaxed, slumping back into the chair with a long exhale. But in Saul's eyes, the translucent man's face was beginning to twist in agony. His suffering didn't resemble being electrocuted. It was more like suffocation. He opened his mouth wide again and again, gasping for breath, seemingly forgetting that he didn't need to breathe anymore. Saul stared at the two contrasting faces and suspected that the man was some kind of spirit. A spirit attached to the girl. "I'm getting pain and exhaustion this time. What about you?" Nick asked after another round of observation. "Suffocation," Saul answered honestly, "like a fish tossed onto land." Nick looked thoughtful. This time he didn't rush to take notes, but instead powered off the control panel and the electro-sense chair. "Your perspective is actually clearer than my single-track emotional sensing." Nick resumed his notes. Saul glanced over and saw a mass of incomprehensible symbols. Watching Nick scribble away with full focus, Saul commented as he read, "Senior Nick, your emotional sensing is actually more accurate. My interpretations of the subject's behavior could easily introduce errors in the information." Nick finished his last note and turned to Saul. "You don't seem like a 12-year-old kid." Chapter 77, An Intriguing Soul Infusion. Before Saul could even try to explain, Nick turned to the female apprentice on the sensory chair and said, "All right, you can leave now. Come back for a checkup at least once within the month. If you feel anything unusual, return early." As the sensory chair shut down, all the restraints automatically released. The female apprentice pushed herself up using the chair's armrests, her steps a little unsteady. She nodded silently at Nick, her expression unreadable. Was she happy or disappointed? Only after she left the lab and shut the door behind her did Nick speak to Saul again. "Now do you know what we're doing here? I saw a mental entity on her that didn't belong to her. Was she invaded by a spirit?" Saul ventured. "Her situation can't be called an invasion. Actually, it's more accurate for you to refer to her as him. After all, the soul of a man is the current owner of that body." Saul's eyes widened instantly. A man's soul, the current owner. What did that mean? Soul possession, or had he changed bodies? "Our experiment is actually the Mentor's project. Its full title is a study on the feasibility and adaptability of transferring souls into other corpses. But the name's too long, so we just call it Soul Infusion." Nick handed a folder of documents to Saul. "You can skip the parts that make you uncomfortable. It's beyond your current knowledge level anyway." Saul looked down and began flipping through the file. As expected, most of the contents were either incomprehensible or made his head spin. All he could gather was that this was a set of experimental observation records. The first few pages detailed the subject's identity, followed by dates, experimental procedures, and more. From the records, he could tell that the soul came from a first-rank apprentice within the tower, while the body belonged to a second-rank apprentice who had died, under various circumstances, but whose corpse remained in good condition. First-rank apprentices were typically older apprentices in their 20s who had yet to advance. Before the experiment, they would sign a contract to voluntarily give up their original body and accept all risks of soul infusion. Of course, how voluntary that was remained debatable. Further along, There were records of different reactions to using the control panel. He merely skimmed those. Too much he couldn't understand. Things like the soul's major attributes, body response indices, flesh freshness, soul cohesion levels, and a whole slew of rune calculations. After reading the file, Saul became sharply aware of how lacking his knowledge was. He had once thought he could learn everything on his own, but now realized that had been arrogant. Still, he used to have Seed constantly looming behind him, forcing him down a risky path just to survive. Now, he could finally study in peace and catch up. Oh, but first, he had to deal with the vengeful spirit haunting him. Senior, is transferring a soul into someone else's body an easy thing to do? Of course not. First, the soul must remain rational and intact. Vengeful spirit or wraith possessing bodies do nothing to advance our research. Then comes the infusion step, which is painful for both the experimenter and the recipient. After all, it's not the soul's original body, and at this step, we've hit a major obstacle. Nick glanced up at Saul's head, his tone slightly probing. If you end up working in this field, maybe we can tackle it together. He flipped the record back to the first page and pointed to the soul and body's genders. So far, we've only succeeded in infusing male souls into female bodies, or vice versa. We can't infuse male souls into male bodies, or female souls into female bodies. Not even the mentor knows why. Saul reread the file and confirmed that was indeed the case. What was this? Opposites attract, same repels. But do souls even have genders, or is it based on the soul's self-perceived identity? Seeing that Saul seemed to be deep in thought, already getting drawn into the topic, Nick felt the time was right to continue his explanation. The last step is prolonged maintenance and observation. Many souls collapse shortly after entering the body. Figuring out how to sustain them long-term is another major challenge of this research. As for observation, that was the experiment we just did. You saw it yourself. The body and soul have almost completely opposite feedback to the sensory chair's stimulation. That's why their behavior is so odd. But solving that is the mentor's problem. For now, we just record the data. Nick retrieved the notebook from Saul's hands. I think you now have a basic understanding of soul infusion. Next, let's call in Subject 2. We've only got 2 people today. Subject 2 was a man. Also someone Saul had seen before in Mentor Rum's class, a second-rank apprentice. Only 2 people. Then that female second-rank apprentice, the one whose back once burst out with a face, hadn't come. Something happened to her. Subject 2's testing process was nearly identical to Subject 1's. Saul helped record the data, and with that, their tasks for the day were done. He wouldn't be involved in the next stages of experimentation. So while Nick was packing up, Saul made his request. Nick paused, setting down the notes, and looked Saul up and down. You've got a vengeful spirit on you. Corpses in the tower are specially treated. It's rare for vengeful spirits or wraiths to escape. Besides, for a vengeful spirit to cling to someone, there needs to be some emotional entanglement. Why would, wait, it's Seed, isn't it? Why does he hate you that much? Even in death he won't let go. That question wasn't easy for Saul to answer. He could only scratch the back of his head innocently. I'm not entirely sure either. Mentor Rum was the one who noticed the vengeful spirit and told me to come find you. Mentor told you to come to me. Nick's expression turned a bit odd. Though he was extremely good at hiding his emotions, nothing showed on the surface. Why, yeah, Saul began to feel nervous under Nick's gaze. I see. After a moment, Nick slowly lifted his chin and nodded at the sensory chair in front of them. Then hop on. So, me, get on that thing. Saul pointed at himself, then at the sensory chair across from him. Yeah, what, you think a mere second-rank apprentice like me is better at dealing with vengeful spirit than the mentor? Nick picked up the control panel again and started tapping. Obviously, It's because this chair is the best tool for tormenting spirits. It can remove a vengeful spirit. Not one that's too powerful, but if the one on you were that strong, you'd already be dead. Nick finished adjusting the controls and noticed Saul still frozen in place. Scared, don't worry, it feels real good. Nick deliberately borrowed Saul's earlier phrase. Saul's mouth twitched. All right, I'm getting on. Nick nodded. I'm really getting on. Nick looked at him oddly. Go ahead. Seeing his diary gave no warnings, Saul figured this wasn't an assassination plot from Nick. He remembered the expression on the male subject's face earlier and decided he had to keep a straight face once it was his turn. Saul climbed into the high-backed chair and flipped himself into place. The sensory chair instantly adjusted to his size and customized a set of restraints. Nick then came up and inserted the fine threads into Saul's skin. The tips were thin and didn't hurt, just a little itchy. Nick only inserted threads at Saul's wrists and ankles, carefully avoiding the left hand and neck. Senior Nick, Saul asked, puzzled. No need to insert so many if we're not tracking your emotions. We just need to deal with the vengeful spirit. Nick returned to the console and picked up the control panel. Saul's heart immediately tensed. He gritted his teeth and clutched the armrests tightly. Hold on, Saul braced himself. Then he saw Nick tap a few buttons on the panel. Chapter 78, I do usually laugh. Saul felt a bit dazed. He had this strange sensation like he was flying. His teeth, it seemed like he had clenched them, but maybe he was just biting air. His hands, maybe they were gripping the armrests, or maybe they were just flailing around in the air, like he was doing the seaweed dance. Saul hated this kind of out-of-control feeling, though he had to admit it felt kind of good. It reminded him of the day he completed his modification, when the whole world turned into soap bubbles, and he was utterly powerless. I have to wake up, Saul murmured to himself in a haze. He began to meditate. The human monster movement diagram appeared in his mind. Dots, lines, diagrams, planes, everything unfolded bit by bit. With the appearance of the lowermost monster, clarity returned, and his thoughts sharpened. Then came the fear. Opening his eyes, Saul saw a phantom crawling all over him. The phantom clung to Saul, its feet pressing against his knees, one hand on his shoulder, the other clawing at the air. Its head was a blur of shadow, with no visible facial features, but it kept swinging side to side, as if searching for something. Oddly enough, although it was perched right on top of Saul, it seemed unable to see him. Its hands waved through the air, passing powerlessly through Saul's body and the chair behind him, unable to touch anything solid. Faintly, Saul thought he heard a roar from his memories. It was Seed's voice. Suddenly, the phantom's head seemed to sense something and snapped around to face Saul. The shadowy face scattered like sand in the wind, slowly revealing Seed's twisted features beneath. His eyes slowly focused. In the next moment, he opened his mouth. Found you. As that monstrous face inched closer, Saul still couldn't move a muscle. All he could do was hold himself steady and lock eyes with those tiny, almost invisible pupils. Seed's terrifying grin widened as he leaned in closer, his ghostly form somehow exhaling a chill as cold as death itself, like it came straight from the depths of hell. That icy breath hit Saul's face, making him blink, but oddly enough, he wasn't as afraid as he thought he'd be. He'd killed Seed once. He could do it again, even if it was Seed's vengeful spirit. Their foreheads were almost touching. A sharp pain began pulsing in Saul's forehead. He was about to risk a mental backlash and strike the ghost when... Suddenly, a flash of indistinct lightning arced from Saul's body, instantly forming a massive net that enveloped Seed's spirit completely. The moment the net touched the spirit, Seed's face twisted in agony. He opened his mouth wide, revealing a pitch-black void behind his teeth. Seed was wailing, but no sound reached Saul's ears. Seed arched backward, trying to escape, but his limbs seemed glued to Saul, unable to pull away no matter how he struggled. Under the electric nets assault, Seed's spirit grew more and more transparent, rippling and flickering like it could vanish at any second. At the last moment, he gave up trying to flee and lunged at Saul again, mouth stretching grotesquely wide, so wide it looked like it might split open to the back of his skull, ready to swallow Saul's entire face. In a flash, another silver-white net burst from Saul's body, slamming directly onto Seed's face and blocking the attack. The net tightened, and Seed's already fragile spirit began to emit wisps of green smoke. The net slowly sank into Seed's form, like squeezing an overinflated balloon. Until, bang! Seed's spirit shattered under the pressure. Saul's mind filled in the explosion sound on its own, and his whole body felt suddenly lighter. At the exact moment Seed's ghost burst, Saul caught a glimpse, just for an instant, of a white shadow and a black shadow fleeing from the remains of Seed's spirit. The white one dove into Saul's left hand. The black one tried to escape, but was yanked towards Saul's left shoulder by an overwhelming force. If Saul could move, he'd probably have turned his head instantly to track that black shadow. What was in his left shoulder? The diary. The next moment, Saul felt a powerful sensation of falling, and his whole being crashed back into his body. It didn't hurt, but he felt weak. Nick's cold voice rang out. "All right, the spirit clinging to you has been purged." Saul weakly raised his head, just in time to see Nick placing the control panel back on the table. Seeing Saul regain consciousness, Nick slightly lowered his head and asked, "So, that was fast, right?" Saul replied feebly, "How long was I out?" Nick glanced at the hourglass, 1 minute and 45 seconds. At some point, the metal restraints had retracted from Saul's body. He pushed himself up using the armrests and stood. Well, he stood, but the moment he tried to take a step, he realized his upper body was moving, while his legs didn't follow. His legs had turned to jelly. He stumbled forward and crashed to the ground. "You all right?" Nick's voice came from across the room, still as indifferent as ever. "I forgot you're still young. You react more strongly to this kind of stimulus." Saul propped himself up with both hands and lifted his head. Why did it feel like Nick was mocking him? But when he looked, Nick's expression was as cold and emotionless as ever, no trace of mockery. Saul gave up and sat on the ground, waiting for the feeling to return to his legs before slowly standing again. "Well, today's experiment is done. You can go rest now," Nick said as he tidied up the lab, making no move to help. "Got it, Senior." Saul stood, his legs still wobbly, like he was walking on cotton. "When should I come back tomorrow?" "No need to be so frequent. Once every 3 days will do," Nick replied, pausing to glance at Saul's still shaking legs. "Even test subjects need rest." So, that was definitely mockery. In the end, Saul left the lab while leaning against the wall for support. As soon as the door closed behind him, he vaguely heard an exaggerated fit of laughter from within. Laughing so hard it sounded like someone was dying. Then something slammed into a desk. Then something heavy hit the floor. Then fists pounded the ground. And the laughter never stopped. "Seriously, you're laughing that hard, and you claim to be good at managing emotions," Saul cursed silently. "This is how you manage them." The noise from the lab continued. Mixed in with the wild laughter, Saul began to hear a hint of pain. His annoyance was swiftly replaced by an inexplicable sense of dread. He pressed his lips together tightly, gave the tightly shut lab door one last glance, and hurried away. The laughter finally faded behind him. So that no one would notice anything odd, Saul straightened up before reaching the slope, pretending nothing was wrong. It's hard to go downhill, especially when your legs are jelly. He barely made it back to his dorm, didn't even reach his bed, and just collapsed face down onto the floor. He had no strength left. He simply relaxed his legs, rolled over onto his back, and stared blankly at the ceiling. So much had happened that morning. The sheer amount of information he'd taken and felt like it was going to make his head explode. The trouble-averse mentor ants. The increasingly influential mutual aid society. The tower master he brushed past. The newly appeared second-rank wizard. Mentor Rum's olive branch. Nick's hidden revelations. And finally, that clash with Seed. Saul suddenly sat up. He looked at his left shoulder. The diary was floating there quietly, calmly watching the show. But just before Seed's vengeful spirit vanished, he had clearly seen a black shadow get pulled into that very spot. If anything could interact with a spirit, it had to be the diary of dead wizard. What was that black shadow? Saul tried to ask the diary, but it ignored him. The black shadow was gone. The diary was as aloof as ever. All he could do now was look into the white shadow that had entered his left hand. His modified left hand was mostly made of plastic bone, designed to enhance magic and boost dark attribute perception. It was mostly for support with a bit of defense. It didn't add much to offense. So most of the time, his left hand didn't stand out. But today, something unusual finally happened. It made Saul a little nervous, worried that one day he'd wake up to find his left hand had mutated beyond control. And even with that faint anxiety, Saul hadn't expected the diary to react when he looked at his left hand. August 25th, year 314 of a lunar calendar, clear skies. You made trash, and it unexpectedly absorbed a soul fragment. That's when you realized your randomly assembled left hand turned out to be a new type of soul resin material. It's pretty trashy as far as soul resin goes, but hey, at least it can store a soul fragment for 2 days. But what can you do with a soul fragment? Play cards with it. Chapter 79, An Honest Soul. Soul fragment probably refers to that white shadow, but what's a soul resin? Is my left hand really that powerful? And what does it mean to preserve a soul fragment? One question after another surged through Saul's mind. He realized just how much he didn't know. He had guessed a modification plan using the diary, but while he could use it, he didn't understand the underlying principles. Which meant his understanding of his left hand was also limited. That soul fragment, could it be Seed's? But what's it for? It's not like I can really play cards with it. And that black shadow diary, did you absorb that black shadow? Saul stared at the diary, a little frustrated. It never listened to him. Of course, it could also be that the diary didn't have any consciousness at all, and all of its actions followed some predefined rules. Just then, the diary suddenly began flipping pages rapidly, the thickness of the remaining pages decreasing at an alarming rate. Wait, Saul tensed immediately. What was happening? Why was it flipping to the back? Would the earlier pages still be usable once it reached the end? Don't tell him now that the diary's warning function had a limited number of uses. But the diary didn't slow down in response to Saul's anxiety. It quickly flipped all the way to the final page. And the last page of the diary was a sheet of black paper. The black paper had no patterns and looked coarser than the rest of the diary's pages. The edges were irregular, as if someone had torn off a square of paper and carefully glued it to the end of the diary. Just as Saul lowered his head to examine this suddenly appearing black page, a white phantom shot out of his left hand and plunged straight into the black paper. A moment later, a line of white text appeared on the black paper, bold, thick ink, the characters crammed together in clumps. Where is this? Why is it so dark? This cluster of words definitely wasn't from the diary. Who was it who was hiding inside the diary? Was it the diary's original owner, or the original Saul? Saul's breath caught for a moment. No, that phantom came out of my left hand just now, your Seed. I am Seed. Who are you and how do you know my name? Oh man, did the diary just level up? No, more likely, Saul had killed Seed's vengeful spirit and obtained a soul fragment, which then activated this new function of the diary. Seeing that the soul could answer questions, Saul's eyes lit up as he asked, Seed, do you remember how you died? I was killed by Saul using by some magical item, but before that, in order to escape an ambush, I had no choice but to break a elf figurine. It caused my mental body to go into an unstable frenzy and I couldn't cast spells, which left me open to being ambushed. Honestly, I was way stronger than Saul. Who are you? How do you know I died? Looks like it really is Seed. Saul guessed this was the diary's ability to communicate with souls. This diary of a dead wizard might be way more powerful than I originally thought. Saul had initially assumed the diary only predicted death, but now it seemed its knowledge spanned death, soul, and matter. He couldn't imagine what kind of person had created this diary of a dead wizard. The two questions Saul had just asked were answered completely honestly by Seed's soul. That gave Saul some ideas about how the diary might work. Was it that souls couldn't lie? No, it must be the diary's power. If vengeful spirit were honest, then where would all the scary ghost stories come from? Seed, Saul grinned, sat down on the floor and started smugly bouncing his leg. Nope, couldn't do it. Leg was still too weak, better just rest it. How do you know about the diary of a dead wizard? The diary was currently Saul's greatest golden finger, and he had to be sure whether anyone else knew about it. That diary of a dead wizard has been passed down in my family for generations. When my grandfather wasn't insane yet, he used to hold that book without a single word on it and just stare at it for hours. According to Seed, his grandfather had once been a powerful first-rank wizard. Because he specialized in dark elements, he was particularly interested in the family's diary of a dead wizard, convinced it contained some kind of mystical knowledge about death. A kind of knowledge that could allow an ordinary wizard to ascend to previously unattainable heights. But after years of studying it, from black hair to white, Seed's grandfather hadn't discovered anything. In the end, he drove himself mad. During the years of his grandfather's madness, Seed's father made a series of poor business decisions, losing a fortune. In the end, the family had to sell off all their possessions, including the diary of a dead wizard, which, by chance, ended up in the hands of a third-rank apprentice from the Gorsa Wizard Tower. That apprentice had bought a bunch of books on magic from Seed's family, and casually said he'd turn them into the library for credit. 3 days after that apprentice left, Seed's grandfather suddenly regained his sanity, and the first thing he did was look for the diary of a dead wizard. When he found out it had been sold, he flew into a rage and almost beat Seed's father to death. Only Seed and his mother standing in the way saved his father's life. Afterward, Seed's grandfather locked himself in his old lab for 3 days and nights. No food, no water. When he came out, he was holding both arms high, laughing like a madman. At the time, he was a disheveled mess, with tangled hair and beard, so everyone assumed he'd just gone insane again. But then screaming, I know now, I finally understand, he suddenly murdered Seed's parents on the spot. And he didn't stop there. He killed everyone who came running afterward. The entire estate turned into a blood-soaked hell. Once he had slaughtered everyone in the manor, Seed's grandfather ran out barefoot and disappeared without a trace. 15-year-old Seed was left curled up, shaking beside his parents' bodies. His pants were soaked and stinking, and the man who had done all the killing was nowhere to be seen. Seed didn't dare move. Afraid his grandfather would notice he was still alive. He waited for a long time. When the crazed laughter finally faded, Seed collapsed on the ground, both legs numb and burning like they'd been dipped in boiling oil. But just as he shakily got back up and looked around, he saw his grandfather returning, holding the severed head of Seed's married elder sister. He tossed the head at Seed's feet, and Seed's legs gave out again, and he collapsed back onto the pile of corpses. His grandfather walked up, slowly crouched down in front of him but didn't strike. Instead, his expression softened, like when Seed was little, full of kindly affection and grandfatherly warmth. "Little Seed, you're a first-rank apprentice now. That's good." Seed trembled all over as he looked at his grandfather. He couldn't understand. How could this man, who had just killed everyone in their family, now be smiling so gently at him? But his grandfather didn't seem to mind his fear. He simply took Seed's cold, corpse-like hand and said, "Now, Grandpa has an opportunity for you to become a great true wizard. Want it?" Seed shook his head so hard it looked like a drum. His grandfather's eyes flashed with murderous intent. Seed immediately switched to nodding just as hard. And so, Seed was sent off by his grandfather to the Gorsa Wizard Tower, becoming an apprentice specializing in water magic. Everything after that, Saul already knew. By this point, the white text on the black paper had faded from a rich milky white to a faint, almost colorless pale gray. The characters, once full and round, had become thin and sharp. Before I left, Grandfather told me he had discovered that the diary was a truly unique artifact. Anyone who still had living relatives couldn't become its master. Even if they obtained it, all they'd see was a blank hardcover book. The diary would only reveal itself after its previous owner died, but whoever personally killed the last owner would never be acknowledged by it. Who are you? How do you know about the diary? What's with all these complex rules? No living relatives, but you also can't kill the last owner yourself. This diary of a dead wizard, could it really follow some kind of karmic law? Saul was puzzled, but at least now he finally understood Seed's motive and the reason for all those clumsy attempts to frame him. It had all been due to the diary's rules. "I don't know, that's just what Grandfather told me. Who are you? What do you mean by karmic law?" Saul completely ignored Seed's question. "Wait, didn't you say you couldn't have any living relatives to receive the diary? But what about your grandfather?" "Grandfather was already dead before I left, but I left in a hurry and didn't get to attend his funeral. Who are you? Why do I have to keep answering your questions?" By now, Seed's writing had faded to a near gray, barely legible. "Your grandfather's dead." Saul narrowed his eyes and leaned closer, carefully examining the black page. Then he let out a quiet laugh and asked, "Where's your grandfather buried?" Chapter 80, Poor Little Seed. Thin, fragmented writing, fine as strands of hair, slowly flowed across the black page. After the final stroke was completed, silence fell. Seed's soul no longer asked who Saul was, nor did it pose any other questions. He was gone. The white characters on the black paper gradually dried and vanished, and the paper itself began to dissolve as if scorched by flame, until not a trace remained. The diary flew back to Saul's left shoulder and closed quietly. So the diary was actually a family heirloom of Seed's. What kind of ancestor could create such a prophetic tool? Given the diary's power, Saul leaned more toward the theory that Seed's family had stumbled upon it by chance. But for various reasons, no one had been able to become its master. Thus, they remained unaware of the diary's true potential. Still, Seed's family might be hiding the diary's origins and other secrets. If the opportunity arose, Saul would consider digging into the matter. But the issue with Seed's grandfather needs more careful planning. I remember Seed touched the diary once before but didn't activate it, so there must be other conditions required to trigger it. As Saul digested the newly acquired information, he glanced at his left hand. So the matter of the soul fragment is temporarily resolved. My left hand, this is a soul resin. I think I've seen that term somewhere before. Yawn, let me try to remember. Saul yawned, climbed into bed like a sleepy animal, and buried his head under the covers. He was truly exhausted. Before his thoughts could drift too far, he fell into a deep sleep. What? Saul opened his eyes before 3 in the afternoon. Though he desperately wanted to sleep until noon the next day, he simply didn't have the guts to skip work. A corporate slave might be able to quit with a bucket in hand, but in a wizard tower, that bucket probably contained your head. The second floor of the East Tower looked the same as always, though the people had changed. Senior Byron had left the morgue the day before. As a third-rank apprentice, he could no longer remain working in the morgue. It would be a waste of his talents in the eyes of the tower. Tasks for third-rank apprentices mostly lay in the outside world, so like the others, Byron would likely be away from the tower for long periods. Before leaving, Senior Byron had instructed Saul that if Concha came asking about whatever Seed was searching for, he should just push everything onto him. Saul figured Concha wouldn't be stupid enough to offend Byron or lose her carefully planted inside contact in the morgue over some mysterious object. Replacing Byron was an unfamiliar second-rank apprentice. The newcomer must have received some briefing from Byron because when he first saw Saul, he even gave him a polite nod. Today's work was as thrilling as ever. Not everyone goes quietly into death. Saul had to slap a crying female corpse into unconsciousness before he could cut off her ear with a knife. That ear sprouted wings and tried desperately to fly away, but Saul tied it up with string and stuffed it into a small box to keep it in check. That night, Saul finally didn't have any nightmares. But in a small city, one barony away from the Gorsa Wizard Tower, someone else wouldn't be sleeping tonight. Since marrying her current merchant husband, Madame Hannah had been living the life of a noblewoman. Especially since her husband was often away on business, the two lived separately and never interfered with each other's affairs. The manor they currently lived in had been purchased from an old steward by the merchant husband. Because the original owners had all died, the manor was bought at a heavily discounted price. At first, Madame Hannah felt uneasy living in a house where people had died, but after a few days, she realized the estate was actually quite wonderful. Spacious, elegant, with front and back gardens, and fully furnished with luxurious furniture. Living here made her feel like a true noblewoman. But at dusk, the front garden suddenly caved in, revealing a stone coffin underground. Madame Hannah rushed to get people to take care of it. Having other dead bodies buried in her home was unsettling. She wanted the stone coffin removed. Then she could go demand compensation from the old steward who sold them the property. But as they tried to move the coffin, the lid unexpectedly slid open. A servant, hopping for some buried treasure, opened it completely on his own. But there was no treasure inside, only a withered corpse. Everyone was disappointed and just wanted to get rid of the thing. But then the corpse inside the stone coffin suddenly reached out and grabbed an old servant standing nearby. The servant screamed and struggled, but he was no match for the corpse's strength. The corpse's charred black skin began to ripple like it was alive, unfolding layer by layer, stretching out into countless thin tendrils. The tendrils wrapped the old servant tightly, like a giant python devouring a deer. Everyone nearby scattered in terror, except for Madame Hannah. Her legs had gone weak with fear, and no one came to help her. She tried to run, but her legs refused to obey, and she collapsed to the ground. Then a shriveled, dark hand reached out to the tearful and trembling Madame Hannah. "Which old servant is this?" Hannah thought as she shakily grabbed the strong hand in front of her. "I'll have to reward him handsomely once I get out of here." But as Madame Hannah stood up with its help, she was met with an unfamiliar, aged face. "No need to panic, madam. That was just a little accident. I've simply been hungry for a long time." The old man had no hair, dark wrinkled skin, and was skin and bones. Madam Hannah finally remembered who he was. Wasn't he the corpse from the coffin? He had come back to life, and was already noticeably plumper than before. Knowing she couldn't outrun him, Madam Hannah broke into cries and begged for mercy. The sound of her sobbing irritated the old man. The skin on his face rippled with movement, and his eyes fell on her plump, fair chest, showing clear desire. "Master," a voice equally old, suddenly drew the elder's attention. He looked up to see a white-haired man in a black butler's uniform holding a set of clothes. The elder smiled. "Hunter, when I first opened my eyes and saw so many strangers, I thought something had happened to you." Butler Hunter calmly stepped forward, handed him the clothes, and helped restrain the struggling Madam Hannah. Old Hunter," Madam Hannah recognized the former steward who had sold them the estate. "Please help me, help me." One of her arms was locked tightly in Hunter's grip. She finally realized this old man was frighteningly strong too. But neither the eerie elder nor the butler paid her any mind. "I figured you'd be starving when you awoke, master. These people are snacks I prepared for you," said Hunter respectfully, delivering a chillingly cruel statement. The elder laughed. "Ha, they're all edible. I've checked, no one with important connections. Please enjoy, master." The elder was thrilled. He grabbed the nearly unconscious Madam Hannah and lifted her to his face. He didn't open his mouth, but from his face to his abdomen, the charred black skin split open from the center, revealing blood-red inner layers. In one bite, he devoured half of Madam Hannah's body. Having just awoken from the stone coffin, the old man took some time to enjoy his feast. Now the entire manor was silent, and the elder, once a desiccated corpse, had returned to the form of a lean, ordinary old man. Only his skin remained dark, tinged with crimson, too unsettling to look at directly. Dressed in the robe brought by Butler Hunter, the elder rubbed his century egg-like bald head. "Looks like it'll take a few days for my hair to grow back. I must look ridiculous right now, huh?" he asked casually. "You are always the epitome of grace, master," Hunter replied respectfully. The two strolled deeper into the manor. "Master has finally awoken. Did you find the diary?" "There was a complication. It seems someone else stole the diary. Little Seed tried to take it back and was killed." "Oh, poor young master," Butler Hunter bowed again, though there was not a hint of grief on his face. "Yes, my poor grandson. He was my last living blood relative." The dark-skinned elder was none other than Seed's grandfather, Ralph, the last surviving member of the Bloodthorn family. But the old man quickly cheered up again. Still, the boy proved useful. Before he died, he found the diary and triggered the mark I left on him. His spirit will continue to cling to the killer. All I have to do is find them in person, and I'll know who holds the diary.